Night the Buddha taught the world to be free, a Buddhist sleep story. There is a place in northern India, not far from the ancient city the world once called Benares, where the grass grows long and soft along the edges of a slow river, and deer have wandered freely for more than 2,500 years. If you were to go there now, if you were to arrive in the early evening, take off your shoes and walk barefoot along the worn stone paths between the old trees, you would notice something. A quality in the air, a kind of stillness that is not empty but full, the way a room feels after a long and meaningful conversation has ended, and both people are still sitting quietly together with what was said, neither one of them needing to add anything more, both of them simply present with the truth that has settled between them. This place is called Isipatana, and tonight you are going to rest here. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to do anything at all. And just let your body settle where it is. Feel the weight of it against whatever is beneath you, the warmth of it, the slow and steady rhythm of your own breathing, and allow the images to come to you gently, the way they always do in the soft country between waking and sleep. The story will find you wherever you are. It has been traveling toward you for a very long time, longer than you know, longer perhaps than any of us can fully reckon. And tonight, at last, it has arrived. Before we come to the words themselves, before we hear what the Buddha said the first time he opened his mouth to teach, how 5 men were changed by it, and how that change moved outward like a stone dropped in still water, ring after ring, until it reached this room, this breath, this exact and ordinary moment, there is something I want to tell you. There is a question the Buddha never answered directly. Not that afternoon in the Deer Park. Not in the 45 years of teaching that followed. Not once in all the thousands of conversations and discourses and dialogues that were remembered and preserved and carried across centuries in the minds and mouths of those who heard them. He was asked the question many times, many forms, by many different people. Scholars and wanderers and kings and farmers and monks who had given everything to find out, and each time he found a way to gently, carefully, without unkindness, set it aside. None, but the answer was always there, hidden inside everything he said, the way the scent of rain is hidden inside the cloud before it falls, present and real and waiting only for the right conditions to become what it always was. By the end of this night, you will hear it. For now, let's simply arrive. The evening of the full moon in the month of Asalha, the specific date by our modern reckoning, would fall somewhere in July, in a year roughly 6 centuries before the beginning of the Common Era. The rainy season has not yet begun. The air is warm and dry, bearing the particular smell of the Ganges plain in summer, grass and river clay and cattle, and the faint green sweetness of growing things that have been drinking deep from the last of the season's rains. The sky above is vast and darkening, and the first stars are appearing one at a time the way they always do, quietly, without announcement, each one simply there when you look, as though it had always been there and you were only now paying sufficient attention to see it. In a grove of trees at the edge of the royal hunting ground, 5 men have been living for some time now. They are not soldiers or merchants or craftsmen or priests in any ordinary sense. They are seekers. Men who have walked away from the comfortable and familiar world in search of something they cannot quite name but cannot stop pursuing. Cannot put down the way you might set down a heavy bag when your arms grow tired, because this particular weight is not in the arms but somewhere deeper, somewhere behind the ribs, a persistent, patient ache that doesn't hurt exactly but won't leave either. Their robes are the color of old ochre, faded by sun and washing. Their faces carry the particular stillness of people who have been waiting a long time without knowing exactly what they are waiting for. Not the stillness of boredom, not the stillness of resignation, but the alert, watchful stillness of those who have learned through long practice to keep the inner ear open even when the outer world offers nothing to hear. Their names are Kandana, Vapa, Badya, Mahanama, and Asaji. 5 names that would become, before this night was finished, The first 5 members of something the world had never seen before and has never entirely stopped needing since. But they don't know that yet. Right now, they are simply 5 men sitting near a small fire as evening deepens around them, talking softly among themselves or sitting in silence, doing what sincere seekers have always done in every age and every tradition, waiting, watching, tending the difficult and demanding inner life they have chosen over every easier alternative. And then one of them looks up. Across the grass, emerging from the tree line on the far side of the park, is a figure walking slowly toward them. He moves without hurry, without performance, without the slightest suggestion of someone who needs to make an impression or establish a presence. And he moves the way a person moves when they have stopped needing to arrive somewhere and are simply here completely in each step as it falls. Each foot placed with the unhurried certainty of someone who has learned that this step, right here, is the only step there is. His robe is saffron. His head is shaved. He is thin from weeks of walking, but his eyes, even at this distance, carry something, a quality of clarity, of settled and untroubled depth. That is hard to name and harder still to look away from once you have seen it. The 5 men have seen this man before. They know who he is. They know where he has come from and what he has been doing and why they are sitting here in this park rather than still with him in the forest. And their history with him is complicated. They agreed not before he arrived. You should know this because it matters, that they would not honor him. They would not rise to greet him when he approached. They would not offer him a seat or water or any of the ordinary courtesies that wandering monks extend to one another as a matter of course. They had their reasons. In their eyes, this man had failed. He had abandoned the great path of renunciation that they had all committed to together, and they had lost their faith in him. And they had made a pact among the 5 of them, a clear and deliberate agreement, and they fully intended to keep it. And then he got closer. Something happened as he crossed the last 100 meters of grass between the tree line and their fire. Something that none of them could explain afterward, not precisely, though they all felt it. All 5 of them, independently, at different moments during those last few seconds of his approach. Some quality in the way he moved, some particular quality of the light in his face. Not a glow, nothing like that, nothing dramatic or supernatural, but the unmistakable ease of a person who has put down an enormous weight and has not yet quite gotten used to how light the world feels without it, who is still, every so often, marveling quietly at the absence of something that used to define the entire texture of every waking hour. One of the 5 men stood up, then another. By the time the Buddha reached the edge of their small fire, all 5 were on their feet. One was offering water, one was spreading a mat, and the careful agreement they had made together, that agreement they had been so certain they would keep, lay forgotten somewhere on the ground between them, like a letter that no longer needed to be sent, because the person you had written it to was already standing in front of you. He sat down. They sat around him, and the stars came out above the Deer Park, one after another, in the enormous quiet of the Indian night, each one taking its place in the dark the way it had taken its place every night. For as long as there had been a sky to hold it, you are here. You are sitting with these 5 men, just outside the circle, near enough to feel the warmth of the fire and hear every word that is spoken. The grass is cool beneath you. The night is warm and still. There is nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to accomplish, no version of yourself you are required to be or maintain or present to anyone. Just this, just the soft dark, and the small fire, and the 5 men in their ochre robes, and the figure in saffron who is about to open his mouth and say something that the world has been waiting for since before the world knew it was waiting. Not. Before he speaks, before that first word breaks the particular silence that has been building since the moment of his awakening, I want to tell you something that most people, when they encounter this story, don't spend much time with. Something about what the Buddha was actually doing in the pause before he began. What was happening in him in those last moments of silence before the first teaching of his life? He was looking at them, really looking. Not at their robes or their postures or their spiritual credentials or the length of their practice, looking at them the way a person looks when they have set down every agenda and every expectation and every need for anything to be a particular way, and can see what is actually in front of them with something close to absolute clarity. Kundana, who was the oldest of the five and had studied the ancient texts since he was a young man and had made a prediction about this very person decades ago that had cost him something to make and had defined the course of his life ever since. Vapa, who questioned everything and trusted almost nothing, who had followed his questions all the way out of ordinary life and into the forest because his questions had taken him there and he had not known how to stop following them. Badia, who was gentle in a way that sat uncomfortably alongside the harshness of the ascetic life he had chosen, who was always the one who noticed when someone was cold or hungry or struggling and did something about it without being asked. Mahanama, steadfast and quiet, not the kind of person whose presence you feel as a kind of anchor, not because he says much, but because when he is with you, you feel that something solid and reliable is in the world. And Asaji, the youngest of the five, the one who listened most carefully and spoke least, who had a quality of attention that was almost startling to be on the receiving end of, the quality of someone who hears not just what you say, but what you mean, and sometimes what you didn't know you meant until you heard it reflected back. The Buddha looked at each of them, and something in his face in the quality of that looking was tender. Not pitying, not condescending, not the tenderness of someone who thinks they know more than you and feels sorry for your ignorance. Tender the way you look at someone you have missed without quite knowing you were missing them. The particular warmth that arises when something you had almost given up on turns out to still be here, still alive, still possible. And he had walked 5 weeks to find these 5 men. Through heat and dust and rain and the long flat kilometers of the Ganges plain, past the great holy city of Benares with its burning ghats and its ancient temples and its thousands of pilgrims and priests, across the river and along the road and through the gate of the royal hunting ground. He could have gone anywhere. He could have begun anywhere with anyone, or he could have chosen not to begin at all. Could have sat under his tree for the rest of his life holding the knowledge he had found and saying nothing to anyone. But he had come here, to this park, to these 5 men, and because they were the people he knew best in the world of seekers, because of the years they had shared in the forest, because of what they had been through together, because he believed, in the way he now believed things, with a clarity that didn't need argument or evidence to support it, that they were ready. And the word dukkha was already forming, already present on his lips like the first note of a song that has been waiting all day to be sung, not as an accusation, not as a grim announcement, as an invitation, as the first word of a language he had spent years searching for and had finally, alone under a tree by a river on a full moon night in May, discovered. A language that could actually say something true about the texture of human experience, that could name what every person who had ever lived had felt but rarely dared to say aloud quite so plainly, quite so precisely. Quite so, without drama or despair. He took a breath. The 5 men, all 5 of them, without coordination, without intention, leaned almost imperceptibly forward. And then he opened his mouth, and everything began. You are here for all of it. Let your eyes grow heavy if they want to. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. The words will keep coming, soft and steady as water moving over smooth stones. They will find you wherever you are, in the light or in the dark, in full waking or in the beautiful, unhurried country of sleep. You don't have to hold on to any of it. You don't have to remember or analyze or file anything away for later examination. Let it land where it lands. Let it settle where it settles. The night is long. The fire is patient. And you have arrived at last exactly where you need to be. To understand what happened in the Deer Park that evening, you need to know about the 5 weeks that came before it. Because the Buddha did not walk from Bodh Gaya to Isipatana quickly or carelessly, or simply because the road went in that direction and he had nothing better to do. He walked that road slowly, deliberately, and with the particular quality of intention that belongs to someone who has found something extraordinary and is walking toward the people most likely to be able to receive it. But before he walked at all, before he took a single step on that long road north and west, he sat. He sat for a long time after the awakening, days, perhaps longer. The great fig tree behind him, the Niranjana River a few dozen meters away, catching the early light in a way that must have seemed both entirely ordinary and somehow unspeakably vivid to eyes that had spent a night seeing through to the very nature of things. The birds were the same birds they had always been. The sound of the river was the same sound it had always made. The smell of the air in the early morning, earth and water, and the particular green aliveness of things growing was familiar and unchanged. Yet he looked at all of it with eyes so clear that the clarity itself was almost overwhelming. The way the return to a beloved place after a very long absence can be almost painful in its familiarity. Everything exactly as you remembered it, every detail precise and present, and simultaneously utterly new. He sat with what he had found. He let it settle in him the way large things need to settle, not quickly, not efficiently, but in their own time, finding their own shape in the space that has been made for them. The first question that rose in him was not a question about where to go or who to teach or how to organize what he had discovered into a form that others could receive. The first question was more fundamental than any of those. The first question was whether to teach at all. This is a moment that deserves more attention than it usually receives when the story of the first sermon is told. The hesitation, and because what had broken open in him under that tree, what had become clear to him through the long watches of that particular night, as he had sat with a quality of concentration and intention that had no parallel in any of the years of searching that preceded it, was so deep, so subtle, so thoroughly at odds with the ordinary assumptions and habits that govern how human beings move through their lives, that he genuinely questioned whether it could be communicated. He had spent years learning from the greatest teachers of his time. He had mastered systems of thought and practice that most serious seekers never fully penetrated, and he had pushed the body and the will to extremes that most people could not even imagine. And none of it, not a single one of those methods, not a single one of those teachers, had shown him the direction in which the thing he was looking for actually lay. He had found it by going somewhere else entirely, somewhere none of his teachers had pointed, and somewhere that at the time had felt like failure rather than discovery. How do you teach something that runs directly against everything people already believe they know about the subject? How do you say, "Go this way," when everyone who knows anything about these matters is pointing in a different direction? He sat with the question. The silence sat with him. Then something happened that the old texts record with the particular quality of language they use when they are trying to describe something that is real, but that ordinary language is not quite adequate to hold. The sky opened. Nama Sahampati descended. Brahma, not a god in the way that word is used in the Western traditions, not an omnipotent creator deity, but in the understanding of the ancient Indian cosmology, a being of immense wisdom and compassion, a being so old that the beginning of the present age of the world was somewhere within the reach of memory. And Brahma looked at this man sitting under his tree in the early morning light with the particular light in him and said, simply, urgently, with a quality of genuine appeal, "Please teach." "There are beings," Brahma said, "not whose eyes are only a little clouded, not completely clear, not yet, but not opaque either. Beings who are suffering not because they are beyond the reach of understanding, not because the truth is inaccessible to them, but simply because no one has yet spoken it plainly in their hearing, because no one has stood where they are standing and pointed clearly toward the thing they have been trying so hard to see. If you do not teach, Brahma said, those beings will remain in the dark, not because the light doesn't exist, not because they couldn't see it if someone showed them where to look, but because looking without direction is very hard and very slow, and the suffering in the meantime is real. The Buddha listened to this, and something in him, something that had been there since long before the enlightenment, deep and patient care for the world that had driven him out of the palace in the first place. All those years ago, on the night when he had seen for the first time what human beings are actually capable of enduring, he looked out at the world with eyes that had spent a long night learning to see clearly. And he saw what Brahma had described. He saw the ones whose eyes were only a little clouded. He saw in the vast and complicated field of human suffering people who were ready in the sense of being genuinely open, genuinely willing to look in a direction that was being pointed, genuinely capable of seeing what was there if someone took the time to show them. He would teach. With that decision made, the question became, who first? And the answer came to him quickly, in the way answers come when real clarity has replaced confusion, not as a deliberation, not as a careful weighing of options, but as a simple recognition of what was obviously true. His first teachers, the two great masters under whom he had studied in the early years of his seeking, Alara Kalama, who had brought him to states of profound meditative absorption, and Uddaka Ramaputta, who had brought him further still. These were men of real depth, real attainment, real openness to truth. They would understand. They would be able to receive what he had found in a way that very few others could not. He would go to them. But then came the news, and this is one of those moments in the story that lands in you like a stone landing in still water. Everything perfectly quiet, and then suddenly this ripple of sadness spreading outward, that both of his teachers had died. Alara Kalama had died only days before. Uddaka Ramaputta had died very recently. He had arrived, in a sense, at the very edge of their lives and found them already gone. The people he had most hoped to teach first, the people most prepared to receive what he had to give, were no longer in the world to receive it. He sat with this, the loss of it, the particular quality of grief that belongs to a gift that arrives too late. And then he thought of the five, Kundana, Vapabhadya, Mahanama, Asaji, the 5 men who had served him during the years of extreme asceticism in the forest, who had believed in him with a completeness and a loyalty that had sustained him through those years, who had finally, after the incident with the rice milk, lost their faith in him and walked away to Isiptana, near the holy city of Benares, to continue their practice without him. They had real preparation, they had real sincerity. They had been through enough with him that the teaching, when it came, would have a context to land in. He would go to them, and so he stood up from under his tree, and he picked up his robe and his begging bowl, and he began to walk. The road from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath to Isipatana, the Deer Park outside Benares, is roughly 250 kilometers as the crow flies, somewhat longer on foot along the actual roads. And, through the heat of the North Indian summer, carrying nothing but a robe and a begging bowl, stopping each morning in the villages along the way to receive whatever food people placed in the bowl, sleeping under trees or in the shelter of ruined walls or wherever the evening found him. 5 weeks more or less. 5 weeks of walking, one step after another, through the enormous and ancient landscape of the Gangetic Plain. What does a person think about on a 5-week walk to change the world? This is a question that the texts don't answer directly. They give us arrival and departure. They give us the moments of encounter. But the interior of those 5 weeks of walking is largely silence. We can only imagine him moving through those long days, the road unwinding ahead of him through the heat haze, the dust rising around his feet, the villages appearing and receding, the rice paddies and the mango groves, and the occasional glimpse of the river that accompanied the road for much of its length. What we do have is one encounter, One exchange on the road, a single conversation with a single stranger, that tells us something essential about who this man was in the weeks immediately following his awakening. Something that no description of the enlightenment itself quite manages to convey. His name was Upaka, and he was a member of the Ajivika tradition, a school of wandering ascetics who believed that all beings were carried along by a kind of fixed fate, that nothing anyone did could accelerate or retard the course of their liberation, that all you could do was wait out the appointed time. He was walking in the opposite direction on the road, heading south toward Bodh Gaya, perhaps, or simply moving from one place to another in the way of wanderers, when he saw the Buddha coming toward him from the north, and Upaka stopped. And because there was something about this man walking toward him that made stopping feel not like a choice, but like the only natural response. Something in the quality of his bearing, a particular quality of stillness and ease that he carried with him that you felt before you could name it, the way you feel a temperature change before you can say whether it is warmer or cooler. He asked the question that wanderers and seekers ask each other when they meet on roads. Who is your teacher? Whose lineage do you belong to? In whose name and by whose method do you practice? And the Buddha replied, simply, without drama, without the careful hedging that this kind of question usually provokes, that he had no teacher, that what he had found himself in the forest, without instruction or guidance from any human being, that he was, in the Pali word he used, a Sammasambuddha, one who has awakened completely by their own effort to the full nature of things. Upaka looked at him a long moment. Then he said, and this has always seemed to me one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire early literature, he said, in effect, well, that may be so, friend. And he tilted his head in a kind of non-committal acknowledgement, and he turned, and he walked away down the road. That was the entire encounter. None. The first person to meet the awakened Buddha in the weeks after his enlightenment was a man who essentially shrugged and kept walking. There was no recognition, no conversion, no dramatic transformation, just a moment of slightly skeptical acknowledgement, and then the road, stretching on in both directions, empty as it had been before. The Buddha watched him go. There was something in that parting, something in the particular quality of Upaka's response that confirmed what he had already suspected about the difficulty of what he was trying to do. And then he turned back to his own road and kept walking. And you can imagine him in the evenings when the worst of the heat had passed and the road cooled and the sky turned through colors that seemed to want names that didn't exist yet. And you can imagine him resting under whatever tree offered the most shade at the hottest part of the day, receiving whatever the morning's walking through the villages had brought into his bowl. Rice, perhaps, or lentils, or fruit, eaten slowly, and with the particular quality of attention that characterized everything he did now. And you can imagine him moving through village after village with the same quality of presence that had stopped Upaka on the road, that unhurried, uncomplicated ease, that quality of a person who has nowhere more important to be than exactly here, a quality so unusual in the ordinary flow of human life that people noticed it the way you notice a sudden stillness in a noisy room before you can say what the stillness is. He was not rushing. This bears repeating because it is so different from how urgency usually presents itself. He had found something that he believed could genuinely alleviate the suffering of human beings, had found it after years of desperate searching, had confirmed it through a night of rigorous and complete investigation, and he was walking toward the people he most hoped to share it with, and he was not rushing. Whatever quality of urgency had characterized those years of searching, the pressure, the impatience, the sense that something essential needed to be found before something irreplaceable was lost, all of that had resolved into something entirely different, a steadiness, a quality of deep arrival that he carried with him everywhere now, so that wherever he was became, in some quiet and fundamental way, the place where he was meant to be. The poet Asvaghosha, writing his great Sanskrit poem, the Buddha several centuries after these events, described the Buddha's walk toward Varanasi in language that has stayed in the world's memory precisely because it reaches for something that ordinary descriptive language cannot quite hold. He wrote of a being who moved through the world the way a great lion moves, not in the sense of ferocity or danger, but in the sense of complete, unconcerned, unhurried ease, the ease of a creature that has nothing to prove and nowhere more important to be, who moved the way light moves, Asvaghosha suggested, without effort, without intention to illuminate, illuminating simply because illumination is the nature of light. And there is nothing else for light to do. 5 weeks of that, 5 weeks of the road and the heat and the villages and the evenings and the slow accumulation of distance between where he had been and where he was going. And then one late afternoon, the Deer Park at Isipatana came into view through the trees. The edge of the royal hunting ground outside the great city of Benares, the grass long and soft in the afternoon light, the deer themselves moving through it in their unhurried way, and 5 small ochre shapes in the middle distance, near a fire that was just beginning to matter as the light started to fail. He could see them from far away. 5 men who had once believed in him completely, who had walked away from him in disappointment, who had made a pact between themselves that they would not honor him when he came, and who were, he could see even from this distance, already beginning to move. You are still here, resting in the Deer Park as the evening deepens around you. The grass is cool and the fire is small and the Buddha is approaching across the open ground, and something in the air has the quality of a long preparation reaching its end. Let your body settle a little deeper into wherever it is resting. Let your breathing slow just slightly. The story has been moving toward this moment for a very long time, and now it is almost here, and there is nothing at all you need to do except be present for it in whatever way being present is available to you right now, whether that is full waking attention or the soft, receptive attention of someone already drifting towards sleep. Both are exactly right. Both are welcome. The story will find you wherever you are. Let's stay with the 5 men for a moment longer before the teaching begins, because they matter. Each of them matters as an individual, as a distinct human being with a distinct life and a distinct reason for being in this park on this evening. And the story of what happened here only carries its full weight when you understand who was sitting in that circle, on what they had given up to be there, what they had believed in, what they had expected and why those expectations had collapsed, and how they had arrived at a place of such determined disappointment that 5 people of genuine goodwill had made a collective agreement to be unkind to someone they had once loved. And their names appear together so often in the early texts, the Pankavajja, the group of 5, the 5 companions, that they can begin to feel like a single entity, a kind of composite figure that serves a narrative function rather than a collection of genuinely individual people. But they were 5 distinct men, 5 distinct histories, 5 distinct characters, 5 distinct reasons for being on the path that had brought them all here to the same place at the same time. And tonight, as you rest in the dark and the fire burns low and the night deepens around the circle, I want to give you each of them, not in great detail, not in the way you would detail a biography, but just enough. Enough that when the teaching begins and the words start to land, you will know whose faces they are landing on and what those faces have already been through before this moment. Kandana was the eldest. He had been a scholar of the Vedic texts since he was young, the kind of scholar who doesn't just know the texts but has absorbed them so completely that they have become part of the structure of his thought, woven into the way he sees and categorizes and makes sense of the world. When the infant Siddhartha was born in the Sakya royal household, Kandana was among the Brahmin seers who were called to examine the child and predict his destiny. This was an honored role and a consequential one. The predictions made by such seers were taken seriously, carried weight in the world, shaped the expectations and decisions of powerful people. The other seers, looking at the marks on the child's body, the signs that the ancient tradition said indicated either a great universal monarch or a great spiritual teacher, hedged their predictions carefully. Either one or the other, they said, either a Chakravartin, a wheel-turning king, or a Buddha, an awakened one. The destiny could go either way. Kundana alone said, there is no either. This child will become a Buddha. Nod. He would have been a young man when he made that prediction, still in the early years of establishing himself in the world of sacred learning, and he staked something real on it, his credibility, his reputation among those who would remember what he had said and measure it against what eventually happened. He had been preparing himself ever since, for the moment when the thing he had predicted would come true, and the prince would become the teacher, and the teaching would need to be received by someone ready to receive it. He had been preparing for decades, and here he was in the Deer Park, in the dark, watching the man he had predicted walk across the grass toward him. Vapa was the questioner. This is the word that keeps appearing in different forms in the different accounts that have come down to us. The one who questions, the one who examines, the one who cannot let a thing stand without pressing on it to see whether it is solid. This quality had made him, in the ordinary world, the kind of person who is both invaluable and exhausting to be around. Invaluable because his questions go to the root of things and force real clarity. Exhausting because there is no comfortable shortcut he will allow. He had come to the ascetic life not because someone he admired had recommended it, not because it seemed like a reasonable option among several, but because he had examined every other possibility available to him with the same relentless scrutiny and found them all, in the end, insufficient. He had not arrived at the forest by ruling other things out on someone else's authority. He had investigated each alternative himself in his own experience, with his own tools, and had found one by one that they did not answer the question that would not leave him alone. The forest was what was left after everything else had been weighed and found wanting. He was, in this sense, the most thoroughly motivated of the five, not more sincere than the others, but more thoroughly convinced by his own first-hand investigation that there was nowhere else to go. Badia was gentle. This is the word, gentle, that appears most consistently in the way people remember and describe him. A softness in his manner, a warmth in his way of being with others, a quality of care that sat a little uncomfortably alongside the deliberate harshness of the path he had chosen. The ascetic life was not by design a gentle life. It was a life that valued the capacity to endure discomfort, the ability to sit with pain and cold and hunger, and the various other discomforts that the tradition believed served to loosen the grip of craving on the mind. Adia endured all of this with the same patient steadiness as the others. But he was the one who noticed, without being asked, when someone in the group was struggling and quietly did something about it. He was the one who remembered things, small things, the particular preference someone had expressed months earlier, a difficulty someone had mentioned in passing, and who wove that memory into the fabric of his everyday care for the people around him. He had come to the path, it seems, not primarily because he was dissatisfied with the world, but because he genuinely wanted to understand it more deeply, to be of more genuine use to the beings within it. Mahanama was steadfast on. The word that keeps appearing in connection with him is something like solid, or firm, or reliable, not in a dull or mechanical sense, but in the sense of a person whose commitment to what they have chosen does not fluctuate with circumstances, does not require constant renewal through visible results, does not need the confirmation of approval or progress or any particular feeling. He had decided to pursue this path, and he was pursuing it with the same consistent and undramatic quality of effort that a river applies to the work of shaping stone. Not fast, not spectacular, but ceaseless. And He was the kind of persons in a group provides a kind of ballast, not because he is forceful or assertive, but because he is simply and always there, attending, maintaining the quality of his practice, regardless of what the practice is producing or failing to produce on any given day. And Asaji was young, youngest of the five, quietest, the one whose presence you might easily overlook if you were only counting voices and words, but whose way of listening made him memorable to everyone who had spent time with him. With his whole body. There is really no better way to describe it. When you spoke to Asaji, you had the unusual and somewhat disconcerting experience of feeling actually heard all the way through, without editing or interpretation or the subtle filtering that most listeners apply to what they receive. He took things in as they were, completely, and held them there, and they seemed to stay in him indefinitely in their original form. He would carry what he heard this night, in exactly this quality of complete, unedited reception, for the rest of his life. And what he did with it later, in a single chance encounter on a city street, would change the course of everything that came after. These 5 men had been with Siddhartha Gautama through the hardest years of his search, and through the years of severe asceticism in the Uruvela forest, the fasting that reduced him, by his own account, to a skeleton that could be seen through the stomach wall, and the breath retention practices that produce sensations of fire and pressure in the head, the various other extremities of physical denial that the tradition of his time held as the most reliable path to liberation from the cycle of rebirth. They had served him during these years, brought him water, sat with him through the nights, kept his location known to one another in case his practice brought him to the edge of what the body could survive. They had believed in him with a totality that genuine shared purpose produces, not the forced or willed belief of people who have decided to believe, but the organic certainty of people who have watched someone up close for long enough to know, in a way that doesn't require argument, that they are witnessing something real. And then Sujata came. She was a young woman from a village near the river, and on that particular morning she came to the riverbank where the exhausted and emaciated Siddhartha was sitting, and she offered him a bowl of rice milk. A thick, sweet porridge made with milk and rice that was the kind of food offered at festivals, at moments of celebration, as something rich and nourishing and slightly special, and he accepted it. Then he took the bowl from her hands and he ate, slowly, carefully, all of it. The 5 men watched from a distance, and what they saw landed in each of them differently, but landed in all of them with the same essential weight. He is eating rich food. He is accepting offerings from a village woman. He is turning away from the path. In their understanding, in the understanding of the tradition in which all of them had been formed, not the tradition that said liberation came through the disciplined overcoming of the body's demands, this was not a small deviation. This was not a temporary adjustment to strategy. This was failure. This was a return to the kind of self-indulgence that kept ordinary human beings bound to the cycle of craving and suffering. They had given years to following this man. They had organized their entire lives around the project of supporting his practice and learning from it. And now he was sitting on the riverbank eating sweet rice porridge from the hands of a village girl. They were quiet about their disappointment, as people of genuine sincerity tend to be. They did not make a scene. They did not confront him or argue or accuse. They simply gathered their things, not with the particular controlled economy of movement that belongs to people who are managing something difficult without showing it, and they walked north and west to the Deer Park at Isipatana outside Benares, and where they set up their own practice and their own small community. When he comes, because they knew he would come eventually, knew with the particular certainty of people who have watched someone closely that he would not simply disappear from their lives. When he comes, we will not rise to greet him. We will not spread a mat or offer water or treat him as a teacher. He has given up the path. There is nothing more to learn from him. What they didn't understand was the thing that would take the rest of this night to understand. Not the rice milk was not an abandonment, it was a discovery. Not a giving up of the search, but a turn toward the understanding that the body destroyed is not a body liberated. That wisdom does not arise from an instrument that has been so weakened it can barely function. That the path to the end of suffering does not run through the maximization of suffering, but through something altogether more subtle and more difficult and more hopeful. The Majjhima Patipada, the middle way. Not the palace, not the forest, something else entirely, something the exhaustion and the starvation and the years of extreme asceticism had actually been pointing toward all along, without anyone quite recognizing the direction of the pointing. That comes later. That is the teaching of this night, and this night has not yet begun. For now. The agreement lay in place, and the 5 men sat in the Deer Park in their disappointment and their practice. And the evening came, and the fire was lit, and one of them looked up and saw a figure emerging from the trees, and Kundana stood. He would not be able to explain it clearly, not then and not later. It was not a decision. And it was more like the body acting before the mind had assembled enough information to have an opinion. Something in him responding to something in the approaching figure with the directness and the certainty that belongs to recognition rather than reasoning. Something old recognizing something it had been in one form or another, waiting for since the moment he made his prediction in the royal court of the Sakyas and staked his credibility on it. He stood. And then Vapa stood, the questioner who questioned everything, and even his skepticism had nothing to say in the face of whatever was coming across the grass. And Badia, and Mahanama, and finally Asaji, the youngest, a listener, who stood with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been paying very close attention for a very long time, and has finally, at last, seen the thing they were paying attention for arrive. The agreement dissolved, not broken, not abandoned through weakness of will, but simply no longer relevant. The way a plan to prepare for rain becomes irrelevant when the sky clears. Water was offered, a mat was spread, and the circle formed itself around the fire, and the stars came out above Isipatana, and all 5 men sat in the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been through something difficult together and are, now perhaps for the first time in a long time, genuinely uncertain what comes next. He looked at each of them. You could feel the looking, even now, across all the centuries. You can feel the quality of it in the way the story holds this moment. The particular undistracted quality of a gaze that has set down every agenda and every need and is simply seeing what is there. The night held all of them, and waited. And the words were just about to begin. He did not begin with doctrine. He did not begin with a list or a numbered system or a theological assertion or any of the formal structures that the serious intellectual and spiritual traditions of his time used to organize and convey what they knew. He began with something older and more personal and more immediate than any of those things. He began with their shared experience. He began by acknowledging, directly and without any performance of humility, the thing they believed about him. "You have heard," he said, and his voice was quiet in the way that voices are quiet when they contain something large and have no need of volume to carry it. The way the sound of water is quiet when the water is very deep. "You have heard that I have given up the struggle, that I have turned back, that I abandoned the discipline you witnessed me practice in the forest, and returned to the comfortable ways of someone who does not take the matter of liberation seriously, and that there is therefore nothing to be learned from what I have found, if I have found anything at all." The 5 men said nothing. The fire said nothing. The night around them said nothing, in the way that nights that are present to what is happening say nothing, not from absence but from attention. He paused, and then he said, "I want to tell you about 2 extremes I have seen clearly. 2 ways of living that I have not merely observed from the outside or heard described or reasoned about in the abstract, but actually lived from the inside. lived completely for years with genuine commitment and genuine sincerity, and about what I found at the end of each of them. The first, he said, is a life given entirely to the pursuit of pleasure, to the satisfaction of desire, the gratification of wanting, the constant and systematic provision for every appetite as it arises. He had lived this life more completely than most people ever have, more completely than any of the 5 men sitting with him could probably imagine, having grown up in circumstances that made the fullest possible expression of this way of living available in a way that is available to almost no one. The palace at Kapilavastu, the gardens, the musicians, the servants, the absolute insulation from anything unpleasant or difficult or sorrowful. A life designed with all the resources of a wealthy and powerful kingdom to keep the person at its center perpetually comfortable, perpetually entertained, perpetually fed and warm and surrounded by beauty. And what he had found living that life was not peace, was not satisfaction in any durable sense, was not any kind of resolution to the deep and persistent sense that something important was missing, that underneath all the comfort and all the pleasure and all the endless provision of pleasant sensation, something ached that the provision had never touched and apparently could not touch. The appetite fed only grows larger. The pleasure received only trains the body to want more pleasure. The relief from discomfort that each new comfort provides lasts only until the discomfort returns in a slightly different form and requires a slightly larger response. There is no destination in this direction. You travel it endlessly and arrive nowhere, grow neither wiser nor freer, and the ache beneath it all remains untouched throughout. The second, he said, is a life given entirely to self-mortification, to the deliberate infliction of discomfort on the body, the systematic denial of every need, the treatment of the physical self as an enemy to be defeated rather than an instrument to be used. He had lived this life too, had lived it for 7 years with an intensity and a commitment that had made him, by common agreement, the most accomplished practitioner of his generation in a tradition that took this kind of practice more seriously than perhaps any other in history. He had reduced the body to the very edge of what a body can endure and still function. He had sat through sensations of pain and cold and hunger that most people would have been unable to remain conscious through. And he had done all of this in the sincere belief that the body's demands were the obstacle. That if you could just subdue those demands completely, drive them to silence through the sheer force of will and endurance, what remained would be the pure, unobstructed awareness that liberation required. And what he had found was this: it doesn't work, not because the effort is wrong, not because the commitment is wrong, but because a broken instrument cannot do fine work, because the precision and the sensitivity and the clarity of attention that the investigation requires cannot be maintained in a body that has been driven past the point of basic functioning. You cannot tune a lute with a broken string. You cannot carry water in a cracked bowl. You cannot light a lamp that has no oil. The 5 men were very still. Kandana, who had spent his life in the careful study of traditions and had seen many teachers and many teachings, was watching the man across the fire with the particular quality of attention he applied to things that seemed to him to be reaching towards something real. The quality of listening not just with the ears but with the deeper, quieter faculty that sits behind the ears and recognizes truth when truth is spoken, independent of whether it fits with what was previously believed. Vapa, the questioner, had the look he got when a question he had been carrying for a long time was beginning to feel less like a problem to be solved and more like a door to be walked through. Badia's eyes were soft in the firelight. Mahanama had the stillness of a stone in a river. Asaji was watching and listening with the completeness he always brought to watching and listening. There is a middle way, the Buddha said, a way between these two extremes that is not a compromise, not a lukewarm splitting of the difference, not the moderate position that avoids committing fully to either direction. the Majjhima Patipada, the path that is in the middle, the way the center of an archer's target is in the middle, precisely there, exactly there, reached not by approximation but by accuracy. A third thing, not the average of the other two, but something that the other two were both in their different ways, pointing toward without knowing how to arrive at. Think of a lute, he said. A musical instrument, strung with strings that must be brought to the right tension in order to produce the right sound. If you tighten the strings too much, if you pull them beyond the tension that is right for them, in the belief that more tightness means more music, that if some tension is good, then more tension must be better. The string breaks and there is no music from a broken string, no matter how earnestly you want music, no matter how much you are willing to tighten further. But if you leave the strings loose, if you decline to introduce any tension at all, on the grounds that tension is the source of the problem, and therefore the absence of tension must be the solution, there is no music from that either. Loose strings make no sound worth hearing. The music lives in the tension that is exactly right, not tight enough to break and not loose enough to be silent. The tension of a string that has been brought to its proper resonance and is, in that resonance, finally able to do what a string is for. Your life, he was saying, and you could hear it in the way the five men received it, in the particular quality of their silence. Your life can be tuned this way, not through the maximization of pleasure, which produces a life that is always hungry, always reaching, never satisfied. Not through the maximization of austerity, which produces a life that is always straining, always forcing, never free. But through something that takes the whole instrument, body and mind both, the full complexity of what you are, and asks what kind of tension, what kind of engagement, what kind of practice, allows the whole thing to produce what it is actually capable of producing. The five men recognized something in what they were hearing. Not in their minds, not yet, not as a thought they could have articulated clearly, but in their bodies. In the particular way the body recognizes what is true before the mind has assembled an argument for it, the way you feel the resonance of a struck note before you know what note it is. They had each felt in their own way the inadequacy of both extremes. Nandana had studied enough teaching to know that neither pure hedonism nor pure asceticism had ever produced, in any documented case, the liberation they pointed toward. Vapa had pressed both positions hard enough with his questioning to feel where each one went soft. Bhadia had sat through enough physical suffering in the forest to know that suffering itself was not wisdom. Mahanama had sustained his practice long enough to observe the law of diminishing returns in action, and Asaji had been paying attention the whole time in his complete and unedited way, and had been gathering evidence that something was not quite right in the framework they were all operating within. Vapa, the questioner, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. For Vapa this was significant. This was the vocabulary of his habitual stillness and self-containment, the equivalent of sitting bolt upright and saying, "Yes, that. This is the thing I have been pressing on from the outside and could never find the center of." The Buddha paused. He let the silence do some of the work, the way good teachers always let silence do some of the work. Because silence is not the absence of teaching, but is itself part of the teaching, a space in which what has been said can land and settle and find its shape. And then he said, "There are 4 truths I want you to see. 4 truths, not 4 positions to adopt, not 4 claims to evaluate, not 4 articles of a faith to accept or reject. 4 truths, the kind of truths that exist whether anyone names them or not, the way the nature of fire exists whether anyone has ever described it or not. Truths that are in the texture of experience itself, present in every moment of every human life, visible to anyone who looks at experience with the right quality of attention." He said the word, dukkha, placed it in the air above the fire the way you place something valuable on a table before explaining what it is carefully, deliberately, with the understanding that the person receiving it will need a moment before they are ready for the explanation. Dukkha, a Pali word that does not have a single English equivalent, a word that carries inside it the entire spectrum of human dissatisfaction, from the mildest background restlessness to the deepest anguish, from the slight unsatisfactoriness of a pleasant moment beginning to end to the full weight of grief and loss and the knowledge of mortality. A word that names something every human being who has ever lived has known in the body, whether or not they have ever had language for it. The Katari Arya Sakani, the Four Noble Truths, had been named. All four of them were present now in the space of the teaching, even though only one had been spoken aloud. The way a chord is present in a single struck note, if the note is struck with sufficient clarity, there would be much more to say about each of them. The night would need to go on for a long time yet, but the framework had been established, the direction had been set, and Kandana felt something move in his chest. Something that had been still for a very long time had shifted slightly. The way a door shifts when someone puts a hand against it before pushing. Let your eyes be as heavy as they want to be. Let the words keep arriving, soft as the night air, patient as the fire. The four truths are about to unfold, slowly, in the order that allows each one to prepare the ground for the next. You don't have to hold on to any of it. You don't have to understand it all right now. Just let it come. Just let it come. And there is something worth staying with a little longer here in this first movement of the teaching, before we follow it deeper into the night, and something about the particular quality of courage it takes to say what the Buddha said in those first minutes. Not the courage of someone who is being brave in the face of danger, but the quieter, or unusual courage of someone who has decided to be completely honest about something that most people prefer not to examine directly. He was saying that to 5 men who had given years of their lives to the most demanding spiritual practice available to them. The thing you are trying to do and the framework within which you are trying to do it is built on a partial understanding, not a wrong understanding, partial. The effort is real, the sincerity is real, the goal is real, but the map has a significant error in it. No amount of walking harder in the direction the map points will correct the error in the map. The direction needs to change, not because you have been foolish or because your effort has been wasted, but because the full picture is different from the partial picture, and now there is a full picture available. This is a harder thing to say than it might appear. It is one thing to tell someone they are wrong, and people hear that kind of statement all the time, from all directions, and they have developed the defensive responses that protect them from being moved by every criticism and challenge they encounter. But it is a very different thing. And it requires a very different kind of listening. To hear someone say you are genuinely sincere, you have genuinely worked hard, your effort is genuinely real, and here is a larger understanding that contains what you have been doing and goes further. The 5 men were listening in the second way. You could feel it in the quality of their stillness. Not defensive, not preparing counter-arguments, not waiting for the moment when they could demonstrate the flaw in what they were hearing, present, simply receiving, which is, as it turns out, the only posture from which anything genuinely new can enter. The Katari Arya Sakani, the 4 Noble Truths, were waiting in the night air like 4 doors, each opening into the next, and the man in the saffron robe who had walked 250 kilometers through summer heat to speak these words was about to open the first one. Feel the night deepening around you as this part of the story begins. Now, you have been here long enough now that the Deer Park has become familiar. The quality of the air, the smell of the grass and the river, the small steady fire, the 5 men arranged around it in their ochre robes, a figure in saffron who has been speaking for some time now in a voice so quiet and so unhurried that it has begun to feel less like speech and more like the sound of water, something the night itself is doing rather than something a particular person is doing. Let that quality settle further into you. Let the images soften at their edges just slightly, the way images do when the body is beginning to move toward rest, but the mind is still alert enough to receive what is being offered. Vapa has closed his eyes. Not to sleep, you can tell from the quality of his face, a particular quality of concentrated receptivity that his features have taken on, that he is doing what he has always done, what he cannot help doing even in the midst of experiences that would pull most people out of their analytical habits entirely. He is taking what is being said all the way down into the interior, pressing on it gently, letting it find the level where it either holds or gives way. This is how Vapa has always learned. This is how Vapa has always known what he knows, not by accepting or by deciding to believe, but by testing and by recognizing when something holds under that testing, that it holds. The Buddha's voice has not changed in quality or pace. It remains what it has been from the beginning of this evening, quiet, steady, completely unhurried, the voice of someone who has all the time in the world because they have understood something essential about time, which is that it is not a scarce resource being consumed, but something closer to the medium through which presence moves. He is not performing. He is not trying to convince. He is speaking the way you speak when you know something is true and you trust that the truth, if spoken clearly and without distortion, will carry itself. He said, Dukkha is not only the great suffering, not only the catastrophic losses, the devastating griefs, the moments of acute pain that announce themselves with unmistakable clarity as suffering. Dukkha is the texture of ordinary experience, the background condition of everyday human life, present not only in the moments of clear anguish, but in the slight restlessness that lives inside even the most pleasant moments. The faint sense of something unfinished that persists even through periods of happiness, the particular quality of a pleasant experience that has just begun to end. Not the ending itself, but the beginning of the ending moment, when you feel the first faint intimation that this will not go on forever, that you will have to give it up eventually, that the thing you are enjoying is already, in its very nature, impermanent. You have felt this, you know this, even if you have never had words for it before. It lives in the gap between how things are and how you imagined they would be before you had them. It lives in the moment after a long-anticipated experience, when the experience has finally arrived and some part of you notices before the celebration is even complete that the anticipation was perhaps more sustaining than the arrival. It lives in love, not as an argument against love, not as a reason to withhold love, but as the specific quality of ache that lives inside genuine love. Knowledge that the thing you love is also impermanent, that you will not be able to hold it in its current form indefinitely. That loss is already built into attachment the way shadow is built into light. This is dukkha, not a counsel of despair, not a claim that life is only suffering and nothing else, but an honest observation about the texture of conditioned experience that is made of things that arise and pass, that come together and come apart, that exist in time and therefore cannot be held fixed. Everything you have ever experienced has had this quality. Everything you will ever experience will have this quality, not because something has gone wrong, but because this is the nature of conditioned existence, the nature of being a creature of this kind, in a world of this kind, subject to the laws of impermanence and change that govern everything that has causes, everything that arises from conditions, everything that is not simply and absolutely itself from before the beginning. He spoke of birth, jati, and named it as the first face of dukkha. Not birth as a tragic event, not birth as something that should not have happened, but birth as the original act of entering the stream of conditioned existence, of becoming a thing that exists in time and therefore a thing that will change and age and eventually end. And to be born is to begin a process that will include all that is beautiful and all that is difficult about being alive. And it is to begin it without choosing the terms, to find yourself already in it before you have had any opportunity to understand what you have entered or what will be required of you. And he spoke of aging, jara, the slow and continuous transformation of the body that carries with it the particular form of dukkha that comes from identifying with something that is changing in directions you would not choose. Not the body that you have known as yourself, that you have moved through the world in, that has been the instrument of every experience you have ever had, is not fixed. It was not fixed at the beginning, and it will not remain fixed. It will do what conditioned things do. It will change, will slow, will ache in ways it did not used to ache, will become gradually less able to do the things you have relied on it to do. This is not a punishment. This is not a failure. This is simply what happens when something made of parts and subject to time is allowed to continue in time long enough. He spoke of illness and death, the acute forms of dukkha, the sudden and dramatic intrusions of impermanence into a life that was perhaps moving along in a comfortable enough relationship with its own conditioned nature. He spoke of sorrow, of lamentation, of pain, of grief, of despair. The responses that arise in a being that has become deeply attached to particular conditions when those conditions change or disappear. He spoke of association with the unpleasant, being bound to what you do not want, unable to remove yourself from it, unable to make it otherwise. He spoke of separation from the pleasant, losing what you loved, being parted from what sustained you, finding the hand that was there and then not there. And he spoke of not getting what you want, the gap between wish and actuality that is perhaps the most universal and least dramatic form of dukkha, a small daily register of this fact that things do not arrange themselves according to our preferences. And then he said, and this is the thing that Asvaghosha, a great Sanskrit poet who told the story of the Buddha's life in his Buddha Karita, remembered and preserved most carefully. He named all of this without sorrow, without the tone of a man delivering bad news, none, without resignation or despair or the quality of someone telling you something they wish were not true. He named it the way a skilled physician names the condition they have examined and understood, clearly, completely, without flinching and without exaggeration. Because the naming is not the cause of the condition, and the clarity of the naming is the beginning of the possibility of understanding it. The first truth is not, everything is suffering and there is no way out. The first truth is, there is something here that needs to be seen honestly before anything else can be understood. And there is a condition that is universal and that is usually only half seen. Seen when it announces itself in dramatic form as grief or pain or loss, but not seen in its subtler, more pervasive forms as the background texture of ordinary life. And the seeing of it clearly, the willingness to look at it directly and say, yes, this is what this is the actual nature of my experience. This is what conditioned existence feels like from the inside. That willingness is not pessimism. It is not defeat. It is the first act of genuine intelligence applied to the question of how to live. Queen Maya, the mother of the child who had become this man sitting in the firelight, had died 7 days after giving birth to him. This fact sits in the background of the entire story, never foregrounded, never dramatized, but present. He had entered the world through the greatest loss his father would ever suffer. He had been cared for in those first days and through his childhood by his aunt Mahapajapati, who loved him as completely as any mother loves a child. King Suddhodana, his father, a man of genuine love and genuine fear, man who had heard a prediction he could not quite accept and spent decades trying to prevent its fulfillment, had built around his son a world in which dukkha was simply not allowed in. The old and the sick were kept out of the palace. Death was managed away. Everything that might confront the prince with the actual texture of conditioned existence was carefully excluded from his experience. And it had not worked, not because the palace was insufficient, it was magnificent, not because the love was insufficient, it was real and complete, but because you cannot build a life on the exclusion of truth, and because the truth is patient and will wait and will find its way in eventually through whatever gap is left unguarded. For the prince, the gap was a chariot ride through the city gates, and 3 encounters with the realities his father had been keeping out, and the understanding arriving all at once, not with the force of something that has been building for years finally finding its expression, that he had been living inside a constructed reality and the actual world was different. You can feel Vapa even now, and with his eyes still closed, doing something careful and precise with what he is hearing. The questioner's instinct is alive in him, even in this moment of unusual receptivity, not working against the teaching, but working with it, testing it not to find where it fails, but to feel where it holds, to confirm what part of him already knows, but needs the confirmation of rigorous attention before it will accept. Badia, the gentle one, has tears on his face, quietly, without any theatrical quality, the way tears come when something you have been carrying for a long time is finally given a name, and the naming releases something in you that the carrying had been holding compressed, the kind of tears that are not from sadness but from recognition, from finally hearing in clear and unhurried language something that you have felt in your own life in 100 different forms but have never had a way to say. I am not telling you this to make you despair, the Buddha said. He seemed to feel in the air around the fire the particular quality of reception that a teaching like this produces when it lands on people who are genuinely open to it, the slight weight of it, the slight darkness of it, the slight risk that naming what is difficult might be mistaken for claiming that difficult is all there is. I am telling you this because you cannot find the door until you know you are in the room. He paused, and in the pause he placed a word, placed it carefully, deliberately, the way you place a lantern at the far end of a hallway so that the person who is about to walk the hallway can see that the hallway has an end, even before they begin walking. Samadaya origin. There is a second truth, there is a reason that dukkha arises, and where there is a reason, there is the possibility, not yet stated but implied, hovering at the edge of what is being said, of something different. But first, the first truth must land, must settle, must be received in whatever form it is able to be received right now, by each of these 5 men, by you. In the soft dark on the edge of sleep, let it land gently, not as a weight but as a clarification, not as a door closing but as a light coming on in a room you have been feeling your way through for a long time without being able to see clearly what was in it. The fire burns. The river moves nearby in the dark, and the night holds all of you, the 5 men, the teacher and you, with the patient, unhurried quality that the night always brings to things that need time to settle. There is something the Buddha did in naming dukkha that almost no spiritual teacher before him had done with the same completeness and the same lack of ornamentation. Did not promise that things would get better if you prayed correctly, or made the right offerings, or aligned yourself with the right divine powers. And he did not suggest that suffering was an illusion to be seen through and therefore dismissed. He did not frame it as a punishment for past wrongdoing or a test of worthiness or a temporary inconvenience on the way to some guaranteed good destination. He simply looked at it directly, steadily, without decoration, and said, "This is here, this is real, this is the actual texture of the experience we are all having, and it deserves to be looked at honestly before we go any further. And in the looking at it honestly, something became possible that is not possible when it is being avoided or denied or explained away. In the honest looking, the person looking is no longer at the mercy of what they will not see. They are, a very act of looking, beginning to stand in a different relationship to it, not above it, not outside it, not free of it, not yet, not simply by the act of naming, but different, the beginning of different. This is the first truth, not a conclusion, a beginning, the door through which everything else in this long night of teaching will eventually pass. Something has shifted in the circle since the first truth was named. You can feel it, even from outside the circle, even from the soft edge of attention you are inhabiting right now, somewhere between fully present and beginning to drift. A quality of opening. The way a room feels when a window that has been painted shut for years is finally worked free and swung open, and the air that has been sitting still in the room begins slowly to move. Vadia's tears have dried, but the quality that produced them remains in his face, a softness, a kind of permission that wasn't quite there before. Vapa's eyes are open again, and the quality of his gaze has changed. Still alert, still precise, but with something less like interrogation in it and more like genuine wanting to understand. Mahanama remains as he has been through the whole evening, steady, present, attending. But there is a quality now in his steadiness that is less like the stillness of someone who is waiting, and more like the stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere and is simply here. The Buddha takes a breath, and he says, if there is a truth about suffering, there must be a truth about its origin. Not its occasion, not the particular event or circumstance or relationship that produces a particular instance of dukkha, but its origin, its root. The thing that is actually generating it, upstream from all the occasions and circumstances that seem, from the outside, to be the cause. He called it samudaya, the arising, the coming together of the conditions from which dukkha emerges. And at the center of all those conditions, at the deepest level of what is actually driving the mechanism, there is tanha, craving. The particular quality of reaching, of not being at peace with what is, of the constant subtle or not so subtle pull of the mind away from present experience and towards something else, something better, something more, something other than what is actually here right now. This needs to be understood carefully because it is easy to misunderstand in a way that makes it seem either more severe or more dismissive of ordinary human wanting than it actually is. Tanha is not desire in general. It is not the wanting of food when you are hungry, or rest when you are tired, or warmth when you are cold. It is not the specific wanting of particular relationships, particular experiences, particular forms of beauty and meaning and connection that make a human life worth living. The ordinary responses of a living, feeling, caring creature to the actual conditions of its life are not the problem. The Buddha had a great deal of respect for ordinary human life. He was not offering a teaching that, if followed, would flatten experience into a gray, featureless, wanting nothing, caring about nothing neutrality. Anha is something more specific. It is the quality of reaching that comes from a fundamental misrelationship with the present. The sense that what is here right now is not enough, not right, not what it should be. That fulfillment lives somewhere other than where you are, in something other than what you have, in a condition other than the one you are in. It is the reaching that comes from this, from the background belief, often below the level of conscious thought, that you are incomplete as you are, that something is missing, that if you could just secure the right arrangement of circumstances, you could finally be okay, finally be at rest, finally be free of the faint or not so faint ache that makes ordinary life feel like it is always slightly falling short of what it should be. He described 3 forms of tanha, 3 directions in which this basic reaching tends to move. The first is kama tanha, the craving for sensory pleasure, the reaching for the pleasant experience, the good meal, the comfortable sensation, the beauty that the eyes want more of, the praise that the heart wants to hear again. The reaching is not just for the experience itself, but for the feeling of being satisfied, of having arrived at a state of fullness that will finally persist. And the discovery, made by every human being who has pursued this direction with sufficient thoroughness to reach its actual conclusion, is that it doesn't persist. The pleasant experience ends, and the fullness it produced fades. The reaching resumes for the same thing again or for something slightly different in the hope that the slightly different version will produce the slightly more durable satisfaction. And what accumulates over years and decades of this cycle is not growing satisfaction but a growing familiarity with the gap between what was hoped for and what was actually delivered. A familiarity that tends to produce either a kind of resigned acceptance or an increasingly frantic doubling down on the same strategy that has been producing diminishing returns all along. The second is bhavatana, the craving to become, the deep human hunger to be a different version of yourself, more secure, more capable, more loved, more certain, more at peace, more complete. The sense that the current version of you is insufficient in some essential way that needs to be corrected, and that when it is corrected, when you have finally grown into the person you are trying to become, you will be okay, and you will be able to rest. The particular cruelty of this form of craving, if cruelty is the right word, though it is not quite, is that it uses the best impulses of the human being against itself. The impulse to grow, to develop, to become more fully what you are capable of being. These are real and good impulses. But when they are driven by the belief that what you already are is fundamentally not enough, they produce a life of permanent dissatisfaction, a horizon that keeps receding, a version of yourself that is always just out of reach. The third is vibhavatana, the craving for non-becoming, the flip side of the second form. Not the reaching towards something, but the reaching away from something. The wanting to escape, to be rid of, to not be in the particular condition you are currently in. The wanting to not feel what you are feeling, to not be in the situation you are in, to not be the person you currently seem to be. Same structure as the other forms, same essential mechanism of non-acceptance of the present, just pointed in the opposite direction. Away from what is rather than toward what might be, but the same restlessness, the same inability to be at peace here right now with what is actually the case. Think of a river, the Buddha said, and this is the image that has stayed most clearly in the traditions that preserved his teaching, perhaps because it is so exact, so clear, so immediately visible to the imagination. And you are standing at the edge of a flooded plain and you see the water everywhere. You think, the river has overflowed, the river is the problem. But the river is not the origin of the flooding. The origin is the rain that fell weeks ago in mountains far upstream, in watersheds you have never seen, rain that gathered into streams, that gathered into tributaries, that fed the river until the river could no longer contain what it was being asked to hold, and so it spread. If you want to understand flooding, you have to go upstream. You have to go to where the rain falls. The flood is not the cause. The flood is the distant, visible expression of causes that are somewhere else entirely. Craving is like that. And by the time it is visible, by the time it has taken the form of grasping, of clinging, of the restless and sometimes frantic quality of a life that cannot find peace in what it has already been building for a long time. Not far upstream in the territories of the mind that ordinary attention rarely visits. The reaching you notice is not the beginning. It is the flood. The rain that produced it is something quieter and older and harder to see. Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's aunt, the woman who had raised him after his mother died when he was 7 days old, and who would become in later years the first woman in history to receive full monastic ordination. She understood tanha at its most tender and its most wrenching, the craving for the presence of someone you love, the specific, sharp, unrelenting quality of missing someone who was here and is now gone. And she had raised a child who was not biologically hers with the completeness of love that such children sometimes receive from those who choose to love them. A love that is in some ways more fully chosen, more consciously sustained, than the love that arrives automatically with biological parenthood. And then that child had disappeared into the forest, and she had lived with the not knowing of where he was and what was happening to him. And the particular form of craving that is grief had been her companion through those years. Yasodhara, the wife he had left sleeping when he slipped out of the palace at night to begin his seeking. She understood something different about it. The particular form of tanha that lives inside genuine love, a wanting of the person you love to be fully present to you, completely available, fully yours in the sense of not being called by anything else more strongly than they are called by you. and the discovery, which love always eventually produces if the love is genuine and the honesty is present, that no person can be that. That every person exists in their own interior, which you can move toward and glimpse and be nourished by but never fully enter or possess. That the reaching for complete possession, complete presence, complete union, however understandable, not however human, is itself a form of tanha that will produce in proportion to its intensity a proportionate suffering. The Buddha did not speak their names that night in the Deer Park, but they were present in the teaching the way the sky is present in the reflection of a still lake, not literally in the water, but unmistakably real in the reflection, and more clearly seen in the stillness than in the turbulence. Vadya has leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, toward the fire, not because he is cold, because something in the teaching has pulled him closer, the way a story pulls you closer when it reaches the part that matters most to you. Mahanama has not moved, but there is something in the quality of his stillness that has changed. Less like a stone now and more like a tree, which is still in the same way a stone is still, but also alive in a way a stone is not, responsive to what moves through it, even when it appears not to move. Can you find it right now? Right in this moment, wherever you are in the spectrum between fully awake and almost asleep, the small, not ordinary texture of tanha in your own experience, not the large and obvious forms, the small ones, the very slight preference for the next few minutes to be comfortable rather than uncomfortable, a barely felt wish that the words would keep arriving in just this way, the faint reaching toward sleep, or the faint reaching away from it, depending on which way your particular wanting is pointing right now. These are not dramatic. These are not the forms that cause acute suffering. They are just the weather of the mind, the ordinary, continuous, low-level movement of preference and aversion that runs beneath ordinary experience the way a current runs beneath the surface of apparently still water. The Buddha named them without judgment. This is important. He did not name them as sins, as failures, as evidence of deficiency in the person who experiences them. He named them as conditions, as the natural functioning of a mind that has not yet found a way to rest in what is none, and so keeps reaching in its various directions for something else, not wrong, not shameful, just what the mind does under these conditions until it is shown another way. And Nirodha, the third truth, a possibility of cessation, was hovering at the very edge of what he was saying. Not yet fully spoken, not yet fully landed, but there felt a way you sometimes feel the presence of something important before you can say what it is. A lantern at the end of a long hallway. The sense arriving quietly before any announcement is made that the hallway has an end. A fire shifts. A small shower of sparks rises and is gone. The river sounds nearby in the dark, and the Buddha waits, not from uncertainty, not because he has lost his thread, but because this is how truth is given, a little at a time, with enough silence between each piece for the piece to find its shape, to settle into the space the silence has opened, to become not just information, but something closer to understanding. And there is a practice not prescribed here, not assigned as homework, just offered as a possibility for this moment, of turning the attention, gently and without judgment, toward the specific texture of tanha that might be present right now in you. Not excavating, not analyzing, not judging what you find, just noticing. And the way you notice weather, observing that it is raining without having an opinion about whether rain should or should not be happening. What does the reaching feel like right now? What direction is it pointing? Toward sleep or toward waking? Toward the continuation of the story or toward the end of it? Toward some memory that has surfaced in the half-attention of this drifting state or away from it? The specific content doesn't matter for this noticing. What matters is the noticing itself, the gentle, unjudgmental awareness of the ordinary activity of a mind doing what minds do, the awareness that does not add a story of wrongness to what it observes but simply observes. That awareness, that simple, clean, non-adding quality of noticing, is itself already something different from tanha, and it is already a small movement in the direction the teaching is pointing, not because you have done anything, not because you have tried or achieved or corrected anything, but simply because in the moment of noticing, you are standing slightly apart from the noticing, present to it, but not identical with it, not swept away by it. And that standing apart, however brief, is the beginning of what the Buddha was describing when he spoke of something beyond craving. The night continues. The fire continues. The words continue to arrive, soft and patient, like water that has been traveling a long way and knows exactly where it is going. Let the night carry you a little more deeply now. If you have been on the edge of sleep, let the edge come closer. If you have been awake, let the wakefulness soften. Let it become something more like the quality of attention you bring to a piece of music you love. Not the effortful attention of someone concentrating, but the easy, receptive, open attention of someone who has let the music come all the way in. The words will keep arriving regardless of where you are in the spectrum. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. As part of the teaching, the third noble truth is the quietest. The Buddha knew with the particular knowledge of someone who has made the journey from one side of an understanding to the other and knows what the passage feels like from the inside, that every teaching needs a resting place. A moment when the listener is not being given more to carry, but is instead being shown that the weight they have been carrying can in fact be set down. Not soon, not easily, but actually. Really, this is not consolation, not. This is not comfort of the kind that says everything will be fine while declining to examine whether everything is fine. This is something more demanding and more real, a confirmation that the direction you are walking in leads somewhere. He spoke of nirodha. The Pali word means cessation, the ending, the stopping, the coming to rest of something that has been in motion. A third noble truth is the truth of nirodha. The truth that tanha, craving, the reaching and grasping and pushing away that generates dukkha in all its forms, can actually cease, not be suppressed, not be controlled through force of will and kept down like something you are sitting on. Actually cease, the way a fire ceases when it has no more fuel, not extinguished from outside but ended from within, because the conditions that were sustaining it are no longer present. And I want to pay attention to how he said this, because the how carries as much meaning as the what. He did not say, liberation is possible, but it is very far away, reserved for the few, accessible only after lifetimes of sustained and perfect practice, and in the meantime you should simply endure. He did not position nirodha as a distant prize. At the end of an extremely long road, the carrot held out to keep the donkey moving. He did not speak of it as something extraordinary, not something that would arrive accompanied by dramatic experiences and unmistakable signs and the clear sense of having crossed from one category of being into another, wholly different category. He spoke of it the way you speak of shade on a very hot day, not a philosophical concept, not a theological position, an experience that the body knows before the mind has words for it. Think of a man, he said, who has been walking for a long day through extreme heat. Not merely uncomfortable heat, genuinely extreme, the kind that contracts the body, that makes every movement costly, that reduces consciousness to a kind of narrow focus on the effort of continuing. His feet hurt, his throat is dry, everything in him has tightened, drawn inward, bracing against the ongoing assault of the heat and the effort. Then he comes to a tree, a large, old, generous tree with wide branches and heavy foliage and a deep pool of shade beneath it. And he steps out of the sun and into that shade. He does not, in that moment, ask, "And what is the nature of this shade? What is the philosophical account of coolness? What is the metaphysical status of the absence of heat?" He does not need to ask any of these questions. He simply stops. He simply feels in his skin, in his muscles, in the way his whole body lets go of the bracing it had been maintaining, the relief of the shade, the coolness, the ease, the way something that had been contracted and effortful simply releases, because the conditions that were requiring it to be contracted and effortful have changed. This is Nirodha, not annihilation, not the absence of experience or the flattening of awareness or the end of the capacity to feel and care and be present to the world. The end of a specific fever, the fever of tanha, of the reaching and grasping that generates dukkha. The ending of that, and what follows the ending of that is not nothing. What follows is what was always there beneath the fever: awareness, clarity, the capacity for presence, the warmth of genuine care, not driven by fear or need. All of it still present, still real, but no longer burning, no longer contracted, no longer costing the enormous ongoing effort that the fever was costing. The Pali term for this is nibbana, sometimes translated as nirvana in the Sanskrit tradition. The word comes from a root meaning the extinction of fire, and it is the image of a flame going out, not a flame that has been blown out from outside, not a flame that has been extinguished by force, but a flame that has simply consumed its fuel and has nothing left to burn. What remains when the flame is out is not the presence of darkness, but simply the absence of the burning, the cool air where the heat was, the stillness where the movement was, the ease where the effort was. The Chinese monk Faxian, who walked from China to India in the late 4th century of the Common Era, walked across some of the most difficult terrain on earth through desert and mountain pass and jungle, a journey of several years, came to Sarnath, Isipatana, to this deer park, this actual place, in the year 405 CE. He had walked for years to reach this specific ground, this specific air, this place where the teaching had first been spoken into the world. And when he arrived, he wrote something that has always stayed with me. He said the deer were still there. 900 years after this evening, the deer were still wandering freely through the same park, unhurried and unafraid, as though the quality of the place that had kept them safe on the original evening had persisted unchanged through all the intervening centuries. He described the quality of Isipatana as peaceful, more peaceful than he had expected. He said, and he had expected something significant, having walked for years to reach it, having given his life to the tradition whose first teaching had happened on this ground. He had expected perhaps something grander, more imposing, something with the weight of historical significance visible in the stones and the sky. What he found was a park, trees, grass, the movement of animals, the sound of a river not far away, and a quality in the air, a quality he could not quite name but could not fail to notice, that made him want to simply sit down in the middle of it all and breathe slowly and be very still for a long time. This quality that Faxian felt 9 centuries later, this quality that the deer felt and feel still, wandering freely in a place of safety, this is what Nirodha produces in a place where it has been named and worked toward, and not for even one person genuinely touched. Not a monument, not a drama, not the marks of an extraordinary event. Just a quality of peace, real, simple, inhabitable, ordinary in the deepest sense. A way the deepest things are always ordinary once you can actually see them. He said, it is possible. The Buddha, looking around the fire at these 5 men who had given so much and asked so much and walked so far in the direction of something they could feel but not quite reach, he said, what you have been reaching for is real. The direction you have been walking in is the right direction. What you have been doing has not been mistaken in its orientation, even where it has been mistaken in its method. The thing you have been looking for exists, and it is reachable, and the road that leads to it is walkable by people like you. Not like some different, more perfected category of being, by you as you are, starting from where you are, not for the few, not for the extraordinary, not for the ones who have never made mistakes or never doubted or never found themselves exhausted and uncertain about whether the path was leading anywhere at all. For you, for each of you here, this circle in the firelight, at the edge of understanding something that has been taking shape for years without a clear name. Kundana felt something that he would later describe, in the tradition's careful, precise language, as the first movement of a door, not the door opening, the recognition that there was a door and that it could open, that the opening was not contingent on conditions he had not yet met, but was in some sense already available, already here in this very moment. The stone at the very edge of the hill. Let your breathing slow, even a little more if it wants to. Let the images behind your eyes soften if they want to. The door is here. You do not have to open it tonight. You do not have to do anything at all tonight except be present. In whatever way presence is available to you right now, in the soft country between waking and sleep, in the warmth of this particular dark. The Magga, the fourth truth, the path, is gathering itself in the silence, waiting to be spoken. But first this. First the confirmation that the path leads somewhere real. First, the simple, unhurried, completely unglamorous truth that what you have been looking for is actually there to be found. The fire is low. The stars are fully out. The deer have settled near the tree line, their shapes barely visible in the dark, breathing in the peace that has always been here and always will be. In whatever form this place takes through whatever centuries come after this one, you are here. This is enough. This is in fact exactly right. There is a quality of relief that has settled over the circle since the third truth was named. Not the relief of a problem solved. The problems are all still there. The path still has a long way to go. The 5 men are still the 5 men they have always been, with all the history and the habit and the conditioning they arrived with. But the relief of a direction confirmed. The relief of hearing from someone who has been there, that the there is real. This quality of relief deserves to be felt fully, not hurried past on the way to the next piece of information. The teaching itself is making space for this. The Buddha has paused, as he pauses at the end of each truth, and in the pause the silence is not empty but full, full with what has just been said, full with the particular quality of reception that each of the 5 men is bringing to it, full with whatever is happening in you right now as you rest in the dark and the words settle in whatever way words settle when they find their mark. Assaji, the youngest, the one who listens most completely, has a look on his face that is not quite possible to describe exactly. Something between recognition and homecoming, and something that suggests he has just heard something that he somehow already knew, in the way that the deepest truths often feel when they are finally articulated. Not like new information arriving from outside, but like something that was always somewhere inside being given a name and therefore becoming, for the first time, fully real. The Magga is waiting, the fourth truth, the noble eightfold path. A specific description of how to walk in the direction that the first 3 truths have been pointing, is waiting in the wings of the teaching, ready to come forward. But the Buddha does not rush toward it. He respects the silence that the third truth has opened. He trusts the silence to do what silence always does, when it is the right kind of silence. Not empty the mind, but fill it, in the particular way that relief fills the space left by the easing of tension. Rest here for a moment, you and the 5 men and the night and the fire and the knowing, quiet and new and entirely actual, that the door exists and can be opened, and that the person standing in front of it is exactly the right person to open it, regardless of their history, regardless of their doubts, regardless of how many times they have walked away from one approach and tried another and found that approach wanting too. Regardless of all of that, the door exists, the path to it is real, and the walking of the path begins as all paths begin, exactly here, exactly now, in whatever breath you are in at this moment. One more thing about Nirodha, before the teaching moves into the fourth truth and the night deepens further. One more thing that is worth carrying with you into whatever kind of rest is waiting for you tonight. The Buddha did not say, liberation requires perfection. He did not say, you must eliminate every trace of craving before the door will open. He did not say, the practice must be flawless. The effort must be sustained without interruption. The mind must be in a particular state of purity or readiness before the third truth becomes available as anything more than a concept. What he said, not in those words, but in everything about the way this teaching was structured and given, was that Nirodha is always present as a possibility, not as an achievement waiting at the end of a sufficiently long road, as the nature of things available at any depth of practice, touching even the most ordinary moments of ordinary life when the reaching, even briefly, even accidentally, even in the middle of a perfectly common afternoon, simply stops. You have touched it. Every person who has ever lived has touched it in moments of unexpected stillness or unlooked for joy or the particular quality of peace that sometimes arrives at the end of a long cry or in the middle of a piece of music that is exactly right or in the moment just before sleep comes. These are not counterfeits. These are glimpses of the real thing. Real moments of the fever briefly lifting, real moments of the range resting, real moments of the ground beneath the seeking becoming for an instant perceptible. The practice is not to manufacture these moments. The practice is to create the conditions in which they can deepen, extend, become more reliable, become less accidental and more understood, until finally what was a glimpse becomes a way of being, not because you have forced it, but because you have understood, at a level beneath argument, what was always there. This is Nirodha. This is the third truth, and it is, in every sense of the word, an opening. He said, "There is a path." 4 words. And then he stopped, not because he had lost his thread or was uncertain about what came next, but because these 4 words placed in the right silence, at the right moment, after the right preparation, are themselves a teaching, are themselves, in fact, almost everything that the teaching needs to be. The first 3 truths had done their work, named the condition, identified its root, confirmed that the root could cease. And now these 4 words, there is a path, there is a way through, there is a direction that can be walked by a person of the kind you are, starting from a place of the kind you are in. There is a path. The silence after those 4 words had a different quality from the silences that had come before. Less weight in it, less darkness, and something closer to the quality of a room when the lights come on. Not dramatic, not blinding, just the simple fact of illumination where there was not illumination before, and the small, almost shy recognition of what has always been in the room, waiting to be seen. Not a theoretical path, not a path that might become available under certain conditions for certain categories of people, subject to certain requirements being met. A path, the Magga, existing now, walked before, walkable now, walkable by you, and the Ariya Athangika Magga, the Noble Eightfold Path, is not the reward that comes at the end of the first 3 truths, the prize offered to those who have successfully understood them. It is the 4th truth, equal. In standing to the other 3, the practical answer to the practical question that the first 3 truths naturally produce. Given all of this, given that dukkha exists and has an origin and can cease, what do I actually do? And what does walking in that direction look like in the texture of an actual life? 8 factors. The Buddha presented them not as a sequence in which you complete the first before beginning the second, not as a hierarchy in which some are more important than others, not as a checklist to be worked through from top to bottom and then set aside as completed. No, he presented them as a description, the description of how a person who is genuinely moving toward freedom moves, what they look like from the outside, what their life is shaped by, and what their mind is doing and what their speech is like and what their relationship to their own attention looks like. Not a prescription for a different person you need to become, but a portrait of the direction your becoming is moving in, offered so that you can recognize the direction when you are moving in it and recognize when you have drifted away. Sama. This word precedes each of the 8 factors, and it is doing more work than most translations capture. Sama is usually rendered as right, right view, right intention, right speech, and so on. But right in English carries a flavor of correctness versus incorrectness, of passing a test, of this instead of that. That doesn't quite reach what Sama means. Sama is closer to complete or whole or fully functioning. The rightness of a bow that has been strung to exactly the tension it was made for, known. The rightness of a wheel that has been balanced and true and turns without wobbling. Not the rightness of correctness, but the rightness of fulfillment. The way something is right when it is fully itself, on, doing what it was made to do, functioning as it is capable of functioning. Samadhi, complete view. Seeing that sees what is actually there rather than the version of what is there that craving and aversion and the deep conditioning of the mind have constructed. Not the elimination of the self that is seeing. The Eightfold Path is not a program for the destruction of the personality, despite some misreadings that would have it be exactly that. None. It is the cleaning of the lens through which the self sees, so that what the seeing reveals is actual rather than constructed, real rather than the product of what the mind's habitual distortions have assembled from the raw material of experience. Samma Sankappa, complete intention. On. The three intentions that characterize a mind moving in the right direction. Nekkhamma, which is renunciation, not the giving up of pleasure, not the declaration that pleasure is evil and must be avoided, but the loosening of the grip of craving on the mind so that pleasure can be enjoyed when it is present without the reaching that turns enjoyment into addiction. Abhyapada, which is non-ill will, which means not merely the absence of hatred, but the positive presence of goodwill, the genuine orientation toward the well-being of all beings, including oneself. That arises naturally when the mind is no longer contracted around its own fears and needs. And avihimsa, non-cruelty, the deep orientation of care, the refusal to add to the suffering already in the world. That emerges from a clear understanding of what suffering actually is and what produces it. Samavaka, complete speech, a quality of words that arise from a mind that has begun to be freed from the distortions of craving and aversion. Not words designed to impress, to manipulate, to defend, to wound, to acquire, to protect, and words that say what is true, that say it at the right time, that say it in the way that is most useful to the person hearing it. Words that do not harm unnecessarily, do not divide what should not be divided, not create confusion where clarity is possible. This is not about being nice. It is about the deep recognition that words are never just descriptions of reality. They are themselves part of reality. They change what they describe. They create conditions in the minds of the people who hear them that persist long after the speaking is done. Sammakamanta, complete action, and the way a free person moves in the world, not taking what is not given, not harming life unnecessarily, living with the consistency between inner understanding and outer behavior that the tradition calls integrity. When these are aligned, something in the whole system relaxes, and the ongoing effort of managing the gap between what you understand and what you do. The particular fatigue of living in contradiction to your own clearest knowing becomes unnecessary because the gap has closed, not through force but through genuine understanding that has permeated deeply enough to shape behavior without the need for constant enforcement. Samma Ajiva, complete livelihood. The observation, obvious once stated, somehow rarely stated, that how you spend the majority of your waking hours shapes the mind that inhabits those hours. The work is not separate from the practice. The way you earn your living is not a concession to practical necessity that the spiritual life can be conducted around and despite. It is itself a field of practice, and itself either contributing to or undermining the conditions in which the rest of the path can be walked. The suggestion is not that certain jobs are spiritual and certain jobs are not. It is that the relationship between your work and the values you are developing in the practice, the quality of care, of honesty, of non-harm, matters and is worth attending to. Samavayama, complete effort, and this factor requires the most careful unpacking, because effort is the word that most easily gets pulled toward the wrong understanding. The wrong understanding is that effort here means trying harder, straining more, bringing more force of will to bear. The right understanding is something subtler and more sustainable. The effort of a gardener, not the effort of a wrestler. The gardener does not make the plant grow. The gardener creates the conditions: soil, water, light, protection from what would damage the growing thing, in which the plant grows naturally from its own nature, in its own time. Complete effort is the effort of creating the conditions consistently and patiently, without forcing the results and without abandoning the conditions when the results don't appear on the timeline the effort would prefer. Namasati, complete mindfulness, presence, the quality of being fully in this moment with what is actually here rather than in the past or the future or in the story about the present that the mind is constructing out of memory and anticipation, not the suppression of thought or memory or planning. Those are natural functions of a functioning mind and are not the enemy. But the quality of knowing when you are in thought and when you are in direct experience, of being able to return to direct experience without drama and without judgment when you notice you have wandered away, of receiving whatever is here with a quality of clear and unprejudiced attention that does not add a layer of interpretation before it allows itself to see. Sama Samadhi, complete stillness, the deepening quality of meditative absorption that becomes available when the other factors are in place, when the ethical foundation is stable, when the effort is the right kind of effort, when mindfulness is consistently applied, not forced, not manufactured. The natural deepening that happens to a mind that has been given the right conditions, a lake that has stopped being disturbed by wind and rain, and the throwing of stones gradually becomes still, and in the stillness becomes clear, and in the clarity begins to reflect accurately what is above it. Asaji was taking all of this in with the quality of total attention he always brought to things that mattered. He was not simply memorizing, and he was doing something more like learning the shape of it, the way you learn the shape of a room you have been in many times, not as a list of features but as a spatial reality that you can navigate in the dark. He would carry this for the rest of his life, and one morning, years from now, he would be walking through a city with his begging bowl, and a young man named Sariputta would see him from across the street, would see a quality of his bearing in the particular ease and clarity of a person who has been walking this path for years, something that stopped him in his tracks. And Sariputta would cross the street and ask, "Who is your teacher? What does he teach?" And Asaji would offer four lines that contained the whole of what was being given in this deer park on this evening. And Sariputta would hear those 4 lines and understand the way that Kundana was about to understand in just a few more hours, that he had found what he was looking for. Xuanzang, the great Chinese pilgrim who walked to India 2 centuries after Faxian, the early 7th century of the Common Era, came to Sarnath as Faxian had come, and stood at the pillar that the Emperor Ashoka had erected to mark the spot where the wheel had first turned. He looked up at the 4 lions at the top of the pillar, facing outward, one in each direction, the ancient symbol of sovereignty and proclamation. And he wrote in his record that he could feel, standing there, not what he could only describe as the continuing motion of something that had been set in motion on this ground. Not as metaphor, as a felt sense, as though the wheel the Buddha had described, the Dhammacakka, not the wheel of the Dhamma, was still actually turning, could be felt turning, in the very air of the place where it had first moved. You are connected to that turning. You are not outside this story looking in. You are somewhere in it, somewhere in the 2,500 years of turning that began in this park on this evening, and has been moving outward ever since, through every person who received the teaching and practiced it and passed it on, through every tradition that preserved it, and every mind that understood it, and every life that was changed by the understanding. And the path the Buddha described to 5 men in a deer park in northern India has been traveling toward you for 25 centuries, and tonight it has arrived, here in this room, in this breath, in whatever quality of attention you are bringing to this moment. The path is here. It has always been here, and you are already on it whether you know it or not. simply by virtue of the fact that you are listening for it. And the three dimensions of the path, sila, samadhi, panna, are not three separate programs to be completed in sequence. They are three aspects of a single integrated way of living and being that develop together, each one strengthening the others, each one making the others more possible. The ethical life creates the conditions in which the mind can settle. The settled mind creates the conditions in which wisdom can deepen. The deepening wisdom clarifies and purifies the ethical orientation, which creates better conditions for the settling, which deepens the wisdom further. A spiral, not a sequence. A movement that, once it has genuinely begun, tends to continue and deepen on its own. The way a wheel set in motion on a smooth surface tends to continue rolling under its own momentum. This is what the Buddha had found, not a technique that you apply for a while until you get the result and then stop applying. A way of living that, once genuinely entered into, becomes self-sustaining. A direction that, once genuinely found, known, continues to reveal itself. The way a road that has been walked for a long time gradually reveals, in each new stretch that it continues, that there is more road, that the walking has been heading somewhere real all along, even when it was not possible to see the destination from where you were. The 8 factors. The 3 dimensions, one direction, and it is pointing, has always been pointing toward the place where Kundana is about to arrive. The fire has burned down to a deep, warm bed of coals, the kind of fire that has been going long enough to reach the state past the active burning, and past the high and sometimes dramatic flames of the early hours into the settled radiance of embers. Not spectacular, but genuinely warm, genuinely sustaining. The kind of heat that is more reliable and more lasting than what the flames produced. The circle of 5 men is illuminated in this light with the particular gentleness of late fire illumination. Everything soft at the edges, everything warm in the center, the shadows outside the circle deep and quiet and unthreatening. You are somewhere in the drift now. You may be aware of where you are and what you are hearing, or you may be in the softer country where images and words arrive less like information and more like weather, something moving through you rather than something you are tracking and holding on to. Both are right. Both are welcome. Birds will carry you either way. He was speaking of sila, the first of the 3 great dimensions of the path. The Pali word means something like virtue or ethical conduct or the quality of living that provides the foundation on which everything else is built. But I want to use a different English word for it, a word I think captures what sila actually is in the experience of someone who is practicing it. Ground. Sila is the ground, not a cage and not a rule book, and not a system of rewards and punishments designed to keep behavior within acceptable limits. Ground. The thing you stand on, the thing that makes walking possible. None. The thing that is there beneath your feet whether you are thinking about it or not. That supports the weight of everything that happens above it. That makes the whole enterprise of moving in any direction possible because it is stable, because it is there, because it holds. The 3 path factors that belong to the dimension of sila are right speech, right action, and right livelihood, and the Buddha's teaching about each of them has the same quality that characterized everything else he said this evening. Not a command, not a prescription, not a judgment about what kind of person you currently are and what kind of person you need to become. A description, a portrait of what these aspects of a life look like when the ground is sound, not when the person inhabiting them is genuinely moving in the direction of freedom, when the behavior arises from actual understanding rather than from the effort to comply with requirements. All right speech, samavaka, arises from a mind that has begun to be freed from the most agitated forms of craving and aversion. When the mind is still contracted around its own fear and need, not. Speech tends to reflect that contraction. It manipulates, it defends, it wounds when it feels threatened. It inflates and distorts to protect the image the self is invested in maintaining. When the mind begins to loosen, when the practice of mindfulness and the deepening of understanding begin to reduce the grip of craving on the moment-to-moment texture of experience. Speech changes, not because someone has decided to speak differently, not because a rule has been imposed and is being followed, but because the mind from which the speech arises has changed, and the speech naturally reflects the change. The Buddha once gave a teaching on right speech to his son Rahula that the tradition has preserved with particular care, because it reaches the matter so directly. Rahula was young when he was ordained, perhaps 7 years old, and the Buddha sat with him one day and held up a bowl. He said, "If I were to use this bowl for refuse, known for things that are unclean and should be discarded, if I were to treat it as a container for what ought to be thrown away rather than for what ought to be kept and used and shared, would you consider this bowl fit for the purpose for which it was made?" And Rahula, being 7, looked at the bowl and made the face that 7-year-olds make when confronted with something they find obviously wrong, and said no. And the Buddha said, "A person who uses speech to lie habitually, who treats the instrument of speech as a container for what ought to be discarded rather than for what ought to be carried, has done something similar to their own capacity for truth. And the bowl that should carry clear water now carries something else. The instrument is compromised, and it takes more than deciding not to lie any further to restore it. It takes the patient work of returning, again and again, the standard of honesty, of allowing honest speech to clean the instrument by being itself consistently over time. This is not about being nice. It is not about avoiding conflict or maintaining harmony at the expense of truth. None. It is about something more fundamental. The observation that speech is not merely descriptive of reality, but is itself part of reality. That words create conditions in the minds of those who hear them, that those conditions persist and compound, that the quality of a life and of a community of lives is shaped in significant part by the quality of the words that move through it. Right action, samakamanta, is the quality of movement through the world that belongs to a person whose understanding has genuinely deepened, whose relationship to craving and aversion has genuinely begun to change. Not taking what is not given, not harming life unnecessarily. None. Living with the particular quality of consistency between inner understanding and outer behavior that the tradition means when it uses the word integrity, a word whose root is the same root as integer, as whole, as undivided. Integrity is what you have when the parts of yourself are not in conflict with each other, when what you understand and what you do are the same thing, and you do not need to manage a gap between your clearest knowing and your actual behavior because the gap has closed. The fatigue that comes from living in that gap is one of the most pervasive and least acknowledged forms of suffering in ordinary human life. The effort of being in your behavior on someone slightly different from the person your clearest understanding would be, slightly more agreeable or slightly more defensive, or slightly more compliant with expectations that you have not actually examined and agreed with. This is costly. It is costly in a way that is hard to measure because it has been going on so long and is so constant that it has become the background noise of experience, indistinguishable from what experience feels like. When the gap begins to close, when the alignment between understanding and action begins to develop through practice, through the patient attention of Sila, something in the system releases. Something that has been effortful becomes easier. Something that has been costly becomes gradually free. Right livelihood, samajiva, extends this alignment into the sphere of how you meet your material needs. The observation is not that certain professions are spiritual and certain professions are not, or that the only acceptable livelihood is one that has an obvious and direct relationship to spiritual practice. None. The observation is simpler and more general, that how you spend the majority of your waking hours is not separate from your practice, that the texture of your work shapes the texture of the mind that inhabits it. The values you bring to the question of how to earn your living, honesty, care, the refusal to cause unnecessary harm, are not luxuries to be applied in the remaining hours after work is done, but are themselves the practice, a part of the ground on which everything else stands. Mahanama, the steadfast one, the stone in the rain, has been very still for a very long time now. But his stillness has, in the last hour or so, taken on a quality that is different from the stillness of waiting that characterized the beginning of the evening. Waiting is a kind of suspension. You are not here. You are not quite there. You are in the in-between, not yet. What Mahanama's stillness has now is something else. The quality of having arrived somewhere and simply being there fully, without the effort of waiting, because there is nothing left to wait for. The teaching is here. He is here. Both are real and both are present, and the space between them is not empty but full. Full with what is passing between the man in saffron and the man who has been practicing steadiness for as long as he can remember. And you, here in the dark, wherever you are in the drift between waking and sleep, you are receiving what Mahanama is receiving. In your own way, at your own depth, through the particular quality of attention that is available to you in this particular moment. Not less than his because it is different from his. Not more, just yours, just this, just the words arriving in the dark, soft as the air, patient as the fire's glow, finding their way to wherever in you they can be received. When you live with the quality of sila, not perfectly, not without error, not with the performance of virtue that exhausts the performer and alienates the audience, but sincerely, with the genuine intention of alignment between your understanding and your life, something begins to happen in the mind that does not happen any other way. Noise that was generated by the friction of the misalignment begins to subside, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a room quieting after a gathering has ended and the guests have gone home and the house is settling back into its own silence. Noise that was so constant it had stopped being heard as noise at all becomes slightly less constant, and in the slightly less constant, something else becomes audible, something that has always been there. Something that the noise was covering. This is what samadhi, the next dimension of the path, is the practice of attending to and deepening. And it is where the teaching will go next, the last hours of this long and patient night. There is a teaching that doesn't get enough attention in the larger story of the Buddha's first sermon, and the teaching about the relationship between the ethical dimension and everything else. Because sila is often presented as preliminary, as the entry-level tier of the path, the thing you attend to before the real practice begins, a preparation for the more advanced work of meditation and wisdom. And in one sense, this is accurate. Sila does come first, does provide the ground on which the other dimensions are built. But this sequencing can be misunderstood to mean that sila is less important or less subtle or less the actual thing. That it is a kind of spiritual basics course you complete and then leave behind when you arrive at the more sophisticated material. This is not right, and the Buddha's tone when he spoke of these three factors, right speech, right action, right livelihood, made it clear that it is not right. He spoke of them with the same quality of care and precision and depth that he brought to the discussion of the meditative absorptions and the highest formulations of wisdom. Because sila is not preparation for the path. No, sila is the path. The path begins here, in the quality of how you speak and how you move and how you sustain yourself in the world. Not because these things are easy, but because they are concrete, and because they are immediately available, because every single day offers dozens of moments in which the question of whether your speech is complete, your action integrated, your livelihood aligned with your values, is a live and present question that calls for a live and present response. This is where freedom begins, not in the exotic states of deep meditation, though those are real and important, not in the highest formulations of philosophical understanding, though those too are real and important. In the ordinary texture of how you live, in the quality of the words you say and the way you move through the world and the care you bring to the question of how to meet your needs without causing unnecessary harm. This is the ground. This is where you are standing right now. This is, in the most practical and immediate and undramatic sense, already the path. Let that land gently. Let it find whatever space is available for it in the warmth of this dark, at this hour of the long and patient night. Badia, the gentle one, the one who had wept earlier in the evening and whose face had carried ever since the particular soft quality of someone who has been moved deeply and not yet fully returned from the depth of the moving, has shifted slightly in his position around the fire, not restlessly. The way you shift when something has settled in you that is slightly different from what was there before, when some inner rearrangement requires a small outer adjustment to accommodate it. He looks, in the firelight, like someone who has just remembered something important, not recalled it consciously, not retrieved it from memory with any deliberate effort, but had it come back of its own accord, the way important things come back when the conditions are right, when you have stopped trying to remember and simply let the memory find you. What he has remembered, or what has found him, is something he has always known in some form but has not had a clear name for until this evening. The name is Sila. The knowing is older than the name. The knowing is in the way he has always been, a quality of care that was his nature before he ever heard the teaching, the noticing of others' needs, the doing something about it, a genuine orientation toward non-harm that was not a practice for him but simply the ground of his character. The teaching has not given him something he did not have. It has named what was already there. A naming has made it available in a new way, available not just as something he does instinctively but as something he can do deliberately, consciously, with the understanding of why it matters and where it leads. This is one of the things the teaching does that is perhaps the least dramatic and the most real. It names what is already present in the person who is listening, gives it a context and a purpose and a direction, makes available as conscious practice what was previously only instinct. The ground was already there. The path was already being walked in some partial and unacknowledged way. The teaching does not create the ground. It shows you that you are standing on it. You may be very close to sleep now. That is not a failure of attention. It is, in fact, precisely the right place to receive what comes next. And because what the Buddha was about to describe, the second great dimension of the path, the training of the mind in stillness and presence, is something that the mind at the edge of sleep already knows something about. The quality of attention that exists in the last minutes before sleep comes is already something like the quality of attention that samadhi cultivates. Receptive, soft, not grasping, not pushing away, simply open to what is here. Let that quality deepen if it wants to. Let the words find you wherever you are in it. The Buddha used an image so precise and so clear that it has stayed in the world's memory for 2,500 years without losing its clarity or its power to say exactly the right thing. He said, imagine a lake, not a large sea, not a moving river, not a noisy waterfall, a lake, a high mountain lake fed by springs that come up from the rock below, deep and clear in its nature, settled into its basin the way something that has been in the same place for a very long time settles, with the particular quality of things that belong where they are, that have no impulse to be elsewhere, that are completely themselves precisely because they are not trying to be anything other than what they are. On a windy day, this lake is disturbed. The wind comes across the water and creates waves. Not large waves, perhaps, not enough to disturb the surface, to set it into the constant small motion that makes it opaque, that prevents you from seeing through it to what is below. You can see that there is a sky above and trees around the edges. You cannot see them clearly. They are fractured by the motion of the water into fragments, into pieces that move and change and reassemble themselves differently from moment to moment, never stable, never complete, never showing you the whole of what they are reflecting. And the bottom of the lake, the actual ground beneath all of it, is invisible. You know it is there. You know the lake must have a bottom, but you cannot see it through the disturbed and opaque surface. But on a calm morning, at dawn, before the wind has risen, before the warmth of the day has begun to move the air, the lake becomes still. The stillness comes gradually, so gradually that you might not notice the exact moment when it arrives. Only the fact that at some point it is simply there, the surface glass smooth, the whole lake gathered into itself. Quiet in a way that is not the quiet of something lifeless, but the quiet of something that has come fully into its own nature. And in that stillness, in that particular quality of gathered, patient, unforced quiet, you can see everything. You can see the bottom of the lake, the stones and sand, and the slow movement of things that live at depth. And you can see the sky and the trees reflected in the surface with a precision and a completeness that the wind-disturbed water could never produce. Every branch in place, every cloud perfectly doubled. The whole world above the lake reproduced in the water below with the fidelity of a mirror. And if there is a moon, if the moon has risen and is there in the sky above the lake, you can see the moon in the water. Not a smeared suggestion of the moon, not the fractured pieces of moonlight scattered across the moving water, but the moon itself, complete, exact, luminous, as though it had descended and was resting on the surface of the water, as though the water had taken the moon into itself and was holding it there, showing you the moon more clearly than the sky ever could, because the sky is always moving and the water in its stillness is not. The moon was always there. This is important to understand. The moon did not appear because the water became still. The moon was in the sky whether the water was moving or still, whether the surface was reflecting it accurately or shattering it into fragments or not reflecting it at all. The moon did not need the still water in order to exist, but the still water makes the moon visible, makes it possible for the person standing at the edge of the lake to see with the kind of clarity and completeness that actually shows you the thing rather than an approximation of it. What was always there. This is samadhi, not the moon. The stillness of the water that allows the moon to be seen. The mind, trained in right effort and right mindfulness and right concentration, becomes over time more like the lake at dawn. Not because the experiences that pass through it become less vivid or less varied. If anything, they often become more vivid because they are received with a quality of clear attention that does not add the distortions of craving and aversion to what is actually there. But the relationship to those experiences changes. Instead of being caught in them, spun by them, thrown around by the waves they create, the trained mind begins to receive them the way a still lake receives reflections, completely, accurately, without any of the distortion that movement introduces, and without being changed in its essential nature by what it receives. The reflection is complete. The lake remains a lake. You have touched the lake in stillness. Every person who has ever lived has touched it in the moments when the mind's ordinary agitation briefly subsided and something very clear and very quiet became perceptible in the space that the subsiding opened. Moment of unexpected peace that arrives sometimes in the middle of a difficult day without any obvious reason. The quality of attention that emerges sometimes in the presence of great natural beauty, when the mind, surprised out of its habitual business, forgets for a moment to be anything other than present. The particular clarity that exists in the space after a long cry, when the emotional weather has passed through and not yet returned, and there is just this clear, this open, this quiet. These are not accidents. These are not gifts available only to the lucky. These are glimpses of the lake in its natural condition, glimpses that become more frequent and more sustained as the practice of samadhi develops. Samavayama, complete effort, the first of the three factors in the samadhi group. And here the teaching requires a certain care, because effort is a word that pulls very easily toward misunderstanding. The wrong understanding, the understanding that has caused more suffering in the history of meditation practice than perhaps any other single misapprehension, is that effort means trying harder, pressing more forcefully, applying greater force of will to the project of making the mind still. as though stillness were something that could be achieved by muscling your way toward it, the way you might achieve a difficult physical posture through sheer determination. This is like trying to make turbulent water calm by pressing on it. The pressing creates more turbulence. The harder you press, the more disturbance you produce, the further you get from the stillness you are trying to force into being. Right effort is gardener effort. The gardener does not make the plant grow. And the gardener cannot make the plant grow. That is not within the gardener's power, is not what gardening is not what the word grow means. What the gardener does is prepare the conditions in which the plant can grow, clearing the ground, enriching the soil, providing water, removing what would crowd out or damage the growing thing, protecting it from what would harm it. And then the gardener waits, not passively. The work of maintaining the conditions is real and ongoing, but with the trust of someone who understands that growth has its own timeline and its own logic and will happen, under the right conditions, its own time. Complete effort in the Samadhi group is the effort of creating and maintaining the conditions, the ethical ground, the quality of attention, a willingness to keep returning when the mind wanders, in which the mind's natural tendency toward stillness can express itself, not forcing, not muscling, not pressing on the water, preparing the ground, and providing the conditions and trusting the process. Sama sati, complete mindfulness. Perhaps the most discussed and the most practiced of the 8 path factors in the contemporary world, and therefore the one most in need of being returned to its original simplicity. Mindfulness in the teaching as the Buddha gave it this night is not a technique for stress reduction. Though it is true that genuine mindfulness practice tends to reduce stress as a secondary effect. It is not a mental fitness program, though it is true that it develops qualities of mind that serve many purposes. It is the specific quality of attention that knows what it is attending to, that is present to the actual texture of present experience, rather than to the story about present experience that the mind is constructing from memory and anticipation. The philosopher monk Nagasena, in the celebrated dialogues of the Milindapanha, described mindfulness in a way that has always seemed to me exactly right. He was asked by the Greek king Menander, who ruled in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent in the 2nd century BCE, and who engaged Nagasena in a series of philosophical conversations that the tradition preserved as a text. He was asked, what is the characteristic mark of mindfulness? What is the thing that distinguishes it from other qualities of mind? And Nagasena said, mindfulness is like the king's advisors who hold the king's business in their custody. Whatever enters the mind, a thought, a sensation, an emotion, a perception, a memory, mindfulness takes it up, examines it, identifies it for what it is, not to judge it, not to act on it, not to encourage it or suppress it, but simply to know it clearly, to identify it accurately, to see it for what it is rather than for what it seems to be through the distorting lens of the mind's habitual reactions. King Milinda understood immediately. This kind of clear seeing, neither grasping at the pleasant nor pushing away the unpleasant, neither inflating the important nor dismissing the significant, just seeing what is there with the accuracy of a mirror or the clarity of a still lake. This kind of seeing changes things, not by trying to change them, by seeing them accurately, which turns out to be enough. Samadhi, complete stillness, the deepening of the meditative absorptions that becomes available when right effort and right mindfulness are in place and have been sustained long enough for the deeper quality of stillness to emerge from beneath the surface agitation. And the Buddha had passed through the 4 jhanas, 4 increasingly deep levels of absorption, on the night of his awakening. He did not describe them tonight to the 5 men in their full technical detail. That would come later, other teachings in other circumstances. Tonight he simply named them as a horizon, and as the confirmation that what he was describing was not merely a slight improvement in the quality of ordinary attention, but something more fundamental, a deepening of the mind's capacity for stillness that could reach genuinely extraordinary depths. That those depths were not the exclusive territory of people with unusual gifts, but were available through the practice to anyone willing to walk toward them. Kundana had been perfectly still for a very long time now, and his eyes were half open and utterly quiet. And something in the quality of his stillness had a different quality from the stillness of the other 4 men around the fire. Not better, different. The stillness of someone in whom something is happening that is not yet finished, not yet complete, but that has a quality of inevitability about it. The way a seed has a quality of inevitability about it, once the right conditions have been provided. It will become what it is going to become. The question is no longer whether but when. You are in your own quality of stillness now. Wherever you are in the drift between full attention and sleep, there is a quality of gathering in it. A quality of the mind settling towards something, of the ordinary agitation of waking consciousness finding its level, of the lake becoming, moment by moment, slightly more like itself. Let this happen. Do not try to accelerate it or hold it in place or make it mean anything in particular. Just let the night do what the night does. Let it carry you, unhurried, toward wherever this particular night is taking you. The fire glows, the stars have moved, and the Buddha's voice continues, steady and patient and entirely without urgency, like a river that knows where it is going and is in no hurry to get there because it is already, every moment of its flowing there. There is something I want to say about the lake image that the Buddha used before the teaching moves on, because I think it is one of the most important things he said this evening, and it is the thing most easily misread. The lake does not become more than a lake by becoming still. It does not transcend its nature, does not transform into something other than water and depth and the capacity to reflect. What it becomes in its stillness is more fully itself, more completely what a lake is. The moon it shows in its still surface is not a moon that the lake has manufactured or constructed or earned through the quality of its stillness. It is simply the actual moon, accurately reflected by a surface that has become capable of accurate reflection. This is what samadhi produces in the person who practices it. Not a different person, not a transformed being who has left behind their ordinary humanity and become something else. A person who is more fully themselves, whose perception of their own experience and of the world around them is more accurate, less distorted by the moving surface of habitual reaction, more capable of seeing what is actually there rather than what the agitated, wind-disturbed surface of ordinary attention has been showing them. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the thing that makes wisdom possible. Because wisdom is not a matter of having more information. It is a matter of seeing more accurately. And accurate seeing requires a still surface. And a still surface requires the conditions that Sila provides and the cultivation that Samadhi develops. The 3 dimensions of the path are one path, and the path leads to Panna, to wisdom, which is where the teaching will arrive next, in the very last hours of this long and generous night. There is a quality to the very last part of the night before dawn, a quality that is different from all the other hours. The darkness at this hour is not the darkness of early night, which is still carrying the warmth of the day that has ended and the energy of the lives that are happening in it. This is a deeper, cooler, quieter darkness. The darkness that exists after all the ordinary business of the world has settled, after even the late walkers have gone home, after the fires have burned down and the voices have fallen quiet and the night has become, finally, entirely itself. A darkness that is not empty but full, full with the quality of the world at rest, full with the particular kind of listening that only exists when there is nothing left to compete with it. This is the quality of the circle now. The 5 men and the teacher and the night and the low warm glow of the embers and the darkness around them that is not threatening, but is simply the world having become very quiet, and the words arriving in that quiet with the particular clarity that words have when everything else has stilled. The Buddha was speaking now of Panna, wisdom, the third and deepest dimension of the path, the one that contains the other two and is contained by them, the one that the ethical ground and the cultivated mind have been preparing for since the beginning of the evening. And here is where the path does something unexpected, something that rewards attention. Noble Eightfold Path begins with right view. Samadhi, the quality of clear seeing that understands what dukkha is and where it comes from, and that it can cease and that there is a path. Right view is the first factor of the path, and the path ends. Its third and final dimension arrives at right view and right intention, the same factors at the beginning and at the end. This is not repetition, this is a spiral of. You begin with right view, enough of it to set the direction, enough to understand what you are doing and why, enough to start, and you walk the path, developing the ethical ground, cultivating the stillness, and bringing the attention to bear on the actual texture of experience. And you return to right view, and it is not the same right view you had at the beginning. It is the same factors, the same name, but the depth of the understanding they now contain is different. It has been seasoned by practice, has been tested against experience, has been refined by the constant application of honest attention to what is actually the case. Not the view at the end of the path is not the view at the beginning of the path. And yet it is. This is what a spiral means. You return to the beginning, but you return at a different depth. And right view, samadhi, in its fully developed form is not a belief or a position or a conceptual framework. It is seeing, the direct, immediate, unmediated perception of what is actually the case about the nature of experience, not as something you have been told and have accepted and can articulate, but as something you see. The way you see the floor when you look down at it, the way you see the fire when you look at the fire, without inference, without argument, without the need for any external confirmation, just there it is. And in the tradition of the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, which would develop over the centuries following the Buddha's life and would produce some of the most extraordinary philosophical and contemplative literature the world has ever known. This quality of direct seeing is sometimes described as the recognition that phenomena do not have the fixed, independent, permanent existence that the unexamined mind attributes to them. That what we experience as solid and separate and self-subsisting is actually dependent, relational, impermanent, woven together with everything else in a web of causes and conditions that the ordinary perceptual apparatus, governed by craving and aversion, does not see clearly. Right view, fully developed, is the capacity to see this clearly, not as a philosophical position, but as direct perception, right intention. Samma Sankappa, in its fully realized form, is the natural orientation of a mind that sees clearly. Not three separate intentions laboriously maintained against the pull of competing impulses, but the single integrated quality of a mind that has genuinely understood what it is and what everything else is, and therefore naturally moves, without effort and without enforcement, toward what wisdom and compassion naturally move toward. The Emperor Ashoka came to this understanding through his own path about 200 years after the night we are inhabiting together, and he was the most powerful monarch in the Indian subcontinent, arguably the most powerful human being on earth at the time he ruled, and he had come to power through the ordinary means by which power was acquired in the ancient world: war, conquest, the willingness to use force and to sustain its use until the desired result was achieved. The campaign to subdue the kingdom of Kalinga was one of the defining events of his reign, and by conventional measures it was a success. Kalinga fell, and the territory and population were absorbed into the Mauryan Empire, and the military objective was accomplished. What followed, in Ashoka's own account, was something that none of his advisors or generals could have predicted. He was overwhelmed by what he had done. The suffering produced by the conquest, the dead, the displaced, the grieving, the destroyed communities, the practical reality of what a successful military campaign looks like when you are standing in the middle of it rather than planning it from a comfortable distance, landed on him with a weight he had not expected and could not manage with the ordinary tools of a king. He turned to the Dhamma, not immediately, not all at once, but genuinely, in the way that people turn to things that actually help when the things that were supposed to help have revealed their limits. And what he found there, what the teaching of this Deer Park on this evening offered him, filtered through the centuries and the traditions and the teachers who had preserved and transmitted it, was Panna, the wisdom that sees clearly what suffering is, where it comes from, and what it would mean to organize a life and a reign and an empire in the light of that clear seeing. He erected a pillar at Sarnath, the stone pillar, topped with 4 lions facing in 4 directions, carved from a single piece of polished sandstone, is still standing today. Or rather, the capital with its 4 lions is still standing, on display in the museum at Sarnath, having been removed from the top of the broken pillar some time ago for preservation. The lion capital has become the national emblem of the Republic of India. Its image is on every rupee coin, on the official seal of the Indian government, visible daily to 1 billion people who may or may not know what it is or where it came from. And what Ashoka put on the pillar shaft itself was not a record of his military victories or a declaration of his power. It was a statement of the Dhamma, an inscription in the language of the region, facing outward in every direction, saying something like, "Here is where the wheel turned. Here is where it began, and it can begin again in you in the world if you are willing to look in the direction it points." Panna as governance, wisdom as the organizing principle of power. Ashoka had understood, through the blood and the grief of Kalinga, through the long process of genuine reckoning, that power organized around craving and around the desire to acquire and control and secure produces exactly what dukkha predicts it will produce: more suffering in proportion to the power available to be expressed. And power organized around panna, around the clear seeing of what suffering is and what produces it, produces something genuinely different. Not utopia, not the elimination of all difficulty, but a different quality of governance, a different relationship between the powerful and those they hold power over, a different standard by which the use of power is evaluated. The 5 men sitting in the firelight did not know about Ashoka, and he was 2 centuries in their future, born in a world that the teaching being given this evening would help to shape. But they were part of the chain that led to him, were, in a few hours, about to become the first 5 links in a chain that would stretch from this Deer Park outward through 2.5 millennia to every corner of the world. Can you see clearly enough, right now in this moment, wherever you are in the soft drift of this late hour, to begin, not to complete, not to arrive, not to achieve some terminal understanding that resolves all questions and settles all uncertainty? Just to begin, just to look on with whatever clarity is available to you right now in the direction that the teaching is pointing. The answer is yes. The answer is always yes. The beginning does not require that the conditions be perfect, that the self be ready, that the understanding be complete, that some threshold of worthiness or preparation be crossed before the path can be entered. The beginning is available right now, in this breath, at this depth, with this quality of attention, not from exactly this starting point. The path begins where you are. It always begins where you are. There is no other place it could begin. The darkness around you has a quality to it now that is almost luminous, not because anything has changed in the room or in the night, but because something in the quality of attention has shifted, has settled, has found its level, has come to rest at a depth from which the ordinary objects of perception look slightly different, slightly more themselves, slightly less filtered through the habitual constructions that pass for seeing in the ordinary waking state. This is panna beginning, not arriving, beginning. A door opening, the first movement of a door, the first breath of air from somewhere else. The Buddha paused. the longest pause of the evening, and then he said, in the quiet that the pause had made, in the particular stillness that belonged to this final hour of the teaching, I have given you everything I have found. What happens next is yours. There is a moment in the teaching of any genuine thing when the teacher has to stop. Not because there is nothing left to say. There is always more that could be said, always more that could be elaborated and refined and explored from another angle. But because at a certain point saying more is not what is needed. Not. What is needed is space. Space for what has been said to settle into the depth where it can do what it is capable of doing, which is not what the words can do, but what understanding can do, which is something different, something deeper, something that happens below the level of language and conceptual mind, in a place that language can point toward but cannot enter. The teacher stops and the space opens, and in the space the teaching continues without words. This is what was happening in the circle now. The 5 men and the night and the embers and the teaching moving in them without any further input required from the person who had given it, finding its level, finding its shape, and settling into the depth that each of them had available for it. And you, here in the warmth of the dark in the country between waking and sleep, you are in the same space. The words have arrived. They have been doing what words do when they are received with the quality of attention that has been present throughout this long and patient night. They have been settling, not as information to be catalogued and stored and retrieved later, as something more like weather that has moved through and left the air different, cleaner perhaps, or slightly more still, or very slightly altered in some way that cannot be precisely named, but that is nonetheless real. Panna is not the end of the path. The end of the path, if the path has an end, is something that Panna makes possible, but that Panna itself is not. The end of the path, if we can call it an end, is vimutti, liberation, release. And that is what is coming in the last few hours of this night for at least one of the 5 men sitting in the embers' glow. But before that, this stillness, this quality of the teaching having been given and received and now settling, this moment of the night that is not transition or waiting or preparation but simply itself, complete, present, sufficient, exactly what it is. Rest here if you can. If sleep is very close, let it come on. If you are still somewhere in the territory of waking, let the wakefulness be soft. The story will complete itself in whatever state you are in when it arrives at its completion. It has been patient for 2,500 years. It can be patient for a few more hours of your night. What the Buddha gave to the 5 men in the Deer Park was not a philosophy, not a religion, a sense of a system of belief organized around a set of claims about the supernatural that must be accepted on faith, not a therapy or a self-improvement system or a technique for stress management, though it contains elements that serve all of those purposes. What he gave was a map of experience, a precise, empirically grounded, tested from the inside description of the terrain every human being inhabits, drawn by someone who had traversed that terrain completely and returned with the cartography. Maps are useful not because they are beautiful, not because they are conceptually elegant, not because they satisfy some intellectual need for completeness and coherence. Maps are useful because they allow the person holding them to know where they are, to recognize the features they are seeing, to understand which direction leads toward what they are looking for and which direction leads away from it. A good map doesn't tell you what to want or where to go. It tells you the lay of the land, and so that you can make your own way, in your own direction, with your own understanding of what you are doing. This is Panna. The map becomes so deeply internalized, not so thoroughly absorbed into the way the person sees and moves through their experience, that they no longer need to consult it. The map has become the seeing, and the territory is no longer something separate from the person navigating it, but something they are embedded in and moving through with an accuracy and a fluency that requires no effort because it has become their nature. This is what was beginning this night in the circle around the embers of the Deer Park fire, not completing, beginning. And sometimes beginning is the most important thing. And then Kundana saw. I want to stay with this for a moment before trying to describe it, because the word see is doing more work in this sentence than any ordinary use of the word prepares you for. When we say someone saw something, we usually mean one of two things: either that light from an external object reached the receptors in their eyes and produced a sensory experience, or that they understood something, had a conceptual grasp of a thing that they had not previously grasped. We see a tree. We see your point. These are the ordinary uses. What happened to Kundana was neither of these, or rather was something that contains both but is not reducible to either. He saw a truth, the Four Noble Truths, which had been spoken this evening in quiet language by a quiet man in a quiet park on the edge of a holy city in the middle of the Ganges plain. He saw them, not as propositions he had now decided to accept, not as a framework he had found intellectually compelling and chosen to adopt, not as a belief he had moved from skepticism to commitment about. He saw them the way you see a thing that is directly in front of you and plainly and unmistakably there, with the same immediacy and the same unquestionable certainty and the same complete absence of the need for any further confirmation. Not decided, not concluded, not believed, seen. The Pali term for this is sotapatti, stream entry, the entering of the stream of the path. Current that flows in a single direction toward the liberation that the third truth had described and the fourth truth had mapped. The entering of that stream is irreversible. This is the essential thing about the image. Once you are in the current has you. You may swim against it. You may slow yourself. You may take many more lifetimes before the current has carried you to its destination. But you cannot get out of the current entirely. You cannot unenter the stream. You cannot unsee what has been seen. The direction is fixed, even if the pace is not, even if the remainder of the journey is long. A stone that has gone over the edge of a hill will reach the bottom. It may take a long time. It may bounce and stop and roll a little further and stop again, but it will reach the bottom. The direction was set at the moment it went over the edge. The Buddha looked at Kundana, and in his face was the expression that appears when someone who has given a gift of great value sees that the gift has been received. Not triumph. There is no triumph in this. No sense of having won anything or achieved anything or defeated anyone or anything. Not even quite relief, though there is something in the neighborhood of relief, something that resembles what you feel when you have been holding your breath for a very long time without knowing you were holding it. And then something releases and the breath comes and you feel in the breathing how long you were without it. Something quieter than all of those, the quality of a completion, a circle closing, something that was open finding its closed form. He said, and the Pali words in which this is recorded have a musicality to them, a quality of sound that carries meaning beyond the semantic content of the words themselves. Anyasi Kundano. Kundana knows, Kundana has understood, Kundana has seen. And in the using of this phrase, in the particular form of the verb and the particular emphasis, the name was changed. Name was changed, the way names are changed when something happens to the person bearing the name that is significant enough to require the name to carry a new meaning. Kundana became Anya Kundana, the one who knows Kundana, Anna who is seen. The event of the seeing was written into the name itself, inseparable from it. From that moment forward, the way the record of a great wave is written into the shape of the stone it struck. What did Kundana feel? The tradition offers something, he said, looking at the Buddha in a voice that the text described as clear and quiet. Yad kinchi samudaya dhammam, sabam tam nirodha dhammam. Whatever is of the nature to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. Whatever has a beginning has an ending. Whatever comes together will come apart. Whatever is conditioned by causes will end when those causes are no longer in place. He said this not as a teaching, not as something he had learned and was now reciting, as a recognition, as the spontaneous articulation of something that was simply, plainly, undeniably present to him, the way you say, oh, the way you say, yes, on. with the quality of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time, not minutes, not years, but decades, a whole adult life of searching and practicing and hoping and doubting and continuing anyway, and who has just at last, without drama and without announcement, let it go. The other four men in the circle were very still in the particular way of people who are witnessing something real and feel the reality of it in their bodies and don't want to interrupt it by moving. Vapa, the questioner, who had pressed on everything his whole life and found most things soft, was looking at Kandana with an expression that was not quite bewilderment and not quite recognition, but was the quality you have when you are in the presence of something that you understand is real without yet having the words or the framework to say what it is. Nadia, the gentle one, had his eyes closed, and there was a quality in his face that was not sadness and not joy, but was something that contained both of them and was therefore larger than either. And Mahanama sat as he had sat all evening, steady, present, the stone in the rain. But the stone was different now, had taken on something, was carrying something in its steadiness that had not been there before. And Asaji, the youngest, the complete and unhurried listener, was watching Kandana the way you watch the horizon when something important is just beginning to appear at the edge of it, with the patient and total attention of someone who knows that what they are seeing matters and wants to miss none of it. The Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dhamma, a text that the tradition has preserved as the record of this evening, says that in the moment of Kandana's seeing, the earth shook, that the sound of it rose through every realm of existence, world after world, the way a great bell's tone rises through a space and fills it completely from every direction at once, until there is nowhere the sound has not reached. This is the language of a tradition that understood that the magnitude of what had happened required a magnitude of description that ordinary language cannot provide without help from the mythological imagination. But here is the thing that the mythological language is trying to say, in the hyperbole and the drama and the earth-shaking and the sound rising through all the worlds. Something happened in that park on that evening that has not stopped happening since. Something set in motion that is still in motion. And the Dhammacakka, the wheel of the Dhamma, turned in a grove of trees at the edge of a royal hunting ground in the 5th century before the Common Era, and it has been turning ever since, in every direction, through every tradition and translation and practice, lineage and individual life that the turning has touched and changed. Mahavamsa, the great Sri Lankan chronicle of the history of Buddhism spread through the world, traces the line from this moment outward. And from Kandana's seeing to the other four's eventual awakening to the 60 original disciples who were sent in 60 directions to teach the Dhamma to those whose eyes were only a little clouded, and from those 60 to the thousands who were touched by their teaching. From those thousands to the missions that the Emperor Ashoka sponsored 2 centuries later, missions that traveled to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia and the Northwest and beyond. From those missions to the traditions that grew from them, the texts they carried, the practices they preserved, the generations of teachers and practitioners who received what was passed to them and passed it further, each one a new link in a chain that began on this evening, in this circle, in this first moment of this first seeing. Faxian came to Sarnath in 405 CE, 900 years after this evening, and stood in this park and felt the quality of the air and wept at the reality of what had happened here. Xuanzang came 2 centuries later and stood at the pillar Ashoka had placed at the spot and felt, in the very air of the place, what he described as the continuing motion of the wheel, and the wheel has continued. And through the schisms and the councils and the wars and the political upheavals that shaped and reshaped the traditions, through the translations into Chinese and Tibetan and Japanese and Korean and Sinhalese and Thai and Burmese, and eventually into every major language on earth, and through the migrations and the missionaries and the scholars and the practitioners who carried the teaching into every corner of the world, and through the moment in the 19th century when the West began to encounter the Dhamma seriously for the first time, and through the 20th century when that encounter deepened into something more like genuine understanding, and through the research and the practices and the teachers and the students and the millions of people in the contemporary world who are finding in this teaching something they were looking for without knowing what they were looking for or where to find it. The wheel is still turning. Can you feel it? In this room, in this night, in the words that have been arriving since the beginning of this story. The same wheel, the same turning, the same truth, spoken in a different language and a different time, but pointing in the same direction, toward the same opening, the same door, the same possibility. Kandana saw, and the seeing moved, and the moving has not stopped. Now, in the hour before dawn, the other four men are beginning to ask questions, quietly, with the quality of genuine seeking that is different from the testing questioning that seeks weakness and the skeptical questioning that assumes wrongness. None. Questions that arise from the beginning of understanding and want to deepen it. And the Buddha answers each one in the same unhurried voice, not with the same quality of complete presence that has characterized every word of this long evening's teaching. And in the days that will follow this night, in the late evenings and the early mornings and the hours of sitting that the five men will do in the company of this teacher who has given them something genuinely new to work with. One by one, each of the five will cross the threshold that Kandana crossed tonight. Vapa will see, then Badya, then Mahanama, then Asaji, the youngest, the one who listens most completely, will see, and in seeing will receive what he will one day, in a morning city on the way to somewhere else, give to Sariputta 4 lines, offered simply, without fanfare, that will contain the whole of this evening's teaching, in the form that Sariputta's particular mind can receive and understand. And understanding, Sariputta will go immediately to his closest friend Moggallana, and offer the 4 lines, and Moggallana will understand, and both of them will go together to find the Buddha, and they will become among the greatest teachers in the history of everything. All of this from Kandana's seeing, all of this from this moment, this circle, this fire, this long and patient night. The wheel turns quietly, continuously. It has been turning for 25 centuries, and it will turn for 25 more. In the turning, it has reached you here, in whatever room you are in whatever country, in whatever state of wakefulness or sleep, in whatever particular place in your particular life you are inhabiting tonight. You are part of the turning. You have always been part of it. Let yourself feel the weight of this moment. Not with effort. You are too far into the night for effort. Too close to whatever rest is waiting for you to bring any kind of straining to what remains of this story. Let the weight of it come to you. The way weight comes when you stop holding something at arm's length and let it rest close. You feel it then, not as a burden, but as a presence, as the particular quality of reality that genuinely real things have when you let them actually arrive. Kandana saw something that had been building for his entire adult life through the decades of study and searching, through the years of watching and waiting for the fulfillment of the prediction he had made as a young man in the royal court of the Sakyas, found its completion in a moment that was, by every external measure, quiet and ordinary. A man sitting around a fire at night, listening to another man speak and then seeing. This is how the most important things happen. Not with fanfare, not with the dramatic signs and the unmistakable announcements that the part of us that wants to be sure expects. Quietly, in the middle of ordinary circumstances, in the middle of an ordinary enough evening, in a body that is tired from many months of practice, in a mind that has been attending to something all night and is beginning to be tired in the way minds get tired after long sustained attention. Quietly, just seeing, yes, and the world is different, not because the world has changed, Because the seeing has changed, and the seeing changing changes everything. You are nearly at the edge of sleep. That is exactly right. Let the edge be soft. Let it be close. Let the words come in now as something gentler than information, as weather, as the quality of the night itself arriving through whatever space is open for it in you. The Deer Park is very quiet now. The fire is only warmth now, warmth and memory, and the 5 men are shapes in the darkness, and the stars that were so bright a few hours ago have begun to fade at the edges of the sky, not because they are going anywhere, but because something else is coming slowly from the direction of the east. There is one thing left to tell you. The thing I mentioned at the very beginning of this long night, before anything else was said, before the park had come fully into view, or the fire had been lit, or the 5 men had arranged themselves around it. The question the Buddha never answered directly. None. The one he was asked again and again through 45 years of teaching, by scholars and kings and ordinary farmers and monks who had given everything they had to the practice, and each time set gently aside. The question is, am I free? It was asked in many forms. Is the self eternal or not? Does the awakened being exist after death or not exist, or both or neither? Is liberation the permanence of something or the ending of something, or neither? And these are the forms the question took in the tradition, the philosophical, metaphysical forms. And each time one of these forms arose, the Buddha found a way to acknowledge the genuine impulse behind it, and then declined to answer in the form it had been asked. He said, "These questions do not lead to peace," he said. "They arise from a confusion about the nature of self that the teaching is designed to resolve, not to answer. You cannot answer these questions from inside the confusion. You can only see through the confusion, at which point the questions dissolve. Not because they have been answered, but because the questioner who was confused enough to ask them in that form has changed. But underneath all the philosophical forms of the question, underneath the metaphysical inquiry into the nature of the self and what happens to it, there is a simpler, more immediate, more personal version. The version that is not a philosophical question at all, but a felt need, a genuine wondering, a reaching in the dark for something that would tell you whether you are moving or standing still, whether the practice is working or not, whether what you have been doing with your life has been taking you anywhere. Am I free right now? In this moment, not in some ultimate sense, not as a matter of metaphysical doctrine, just is there something happening in me, even now, even a little, even in this breath, that resembles what the teaching was pointing toward? Is the fever lifting even slightly? Is the reaching quieting, even for a moment? Am I here in the dark at the end of this long night? Am I free? And the answer the Buddha gave, not in words, never in these exact words, but in everything he said and everything he did and everything the teaching has been pointing toward since the first moment it opened, is this: the asking is the answer, not in a cheap way, not as a way of avoiding the question by folding it back on itself, in the deepest way, in the way that is only visible when you have been sitting with the question for long enough and in the right quality of attention on for the question to reveal what it actually is. The question, am I free, when it is asked genuinely, not as a demand, not as a test the present moment has to pass, not as the newest form of the reaching, a grasping now at the idea of freedom rather than at some other object, but as a sincere, open, unhurried inquiry into what is actually happening right now in the territory of experience. That kind of asking is already a movement in the direction of what it is asking about. That sincerity, that openness, that willingness to look, these are already the beginning of the thing being sought, not the fullness of it, not the completion of it. The beginning, vimutti, the Pali word for liberation, from a root that means release, not achievement, not the arrival at a destination after a long and difficult journey, but release. Natural opening of a hand that has been gripping something for so long it has forgotten it is gripping. The easing of a contraction that has been maintained for so long it has started to feel like the natural condition. The ending of a fever that has been running for so long you can barely remember what it felt like before. Vimutti is not something you get to by trying hard enough. It is something that becomes available as conditions change. As the grip loosens, as the fever cools, as the quality of attention becomes clear enough to see what it is seeing, and what it is seeing begins to no longer be the distorted version of things that craving and aversion produce, but something closer to the actual thing. The release happens when the holding is genuinely released, and the holding is genuinely released when there is genuine understanding of what is being held and why, and what the holding has been costing, and what would happen if it were set down. Sariputta would find his way to this understanding through Asaji's 4 lines. Moggallana would find his way through Sariputta's transmission. Angulimala, the man who had lived for years as a murderer in the forest, who wore around his neck a garland made of the fingers of his victims, who was the most feared person in the entire region of Kosala, who met the Buddha on a road one morning, and was so profoundly changed by that single encounter that he entered the monastic life and eventually attained full liberation. Angulimala found his way through a direct encounter with a quality of presence he had never experienced before and could not resist and could not explain. Every one of them found their way through whatever opening was available to them, from whatever starting point they were at, by whatever path was right for the particular person they were. This is what the teaching does. It does not require you to be a particular kind of person before it will work. It does not require purity of motive or freedom from doubt or a certain number of years of practice already accumulated or a life that has been lived in a particular way. It meets you where you are. It asks only, are you willing to look? Are you willing to look at the actual texture of your experience, not the story you tell about it, not the interpretation you have constructed around it, not the version of it that serves the purposes of the self-image you have been maintaining, but the actual thing, the raw and somewhat unruly actual texture of what it is like to be you in this particular moment. Now, if you are willing to look even a little, even imperfectly, even with the understanding that what you see will be partial and distorted and will require many more returns and many more refinements before it begins to approach genuine clarity, the teaching can work with that. The path begins exactly there. The wheel turned in the Deer Park. It turned through Kandana and Asaji and Sariputta and Moggallana and Mahapajapati Gautami and the thousands and then the hundreds of thousands and then the millions who received the teaching in its direct form, in its lineage form, in the forms that the centuries of transmission produced. It turned through Ashoka's edicts and Foxion's walking, and Xuanzang's careful notes, and the Mahavamsa's recorded history, and the 1,000-year conversation between the Indian tradition, and the Chinese tradition, and the Tibetan tradition, and the Japanese tradition, and all the others. And it turned through the moment when the West first encountered the Dhamma seriously, and began the long and still continuing process of understanding what it had found. And it turned through the research and the writing and the teaching and the practice lineages and the millions of people in the contemporary world who are finding this 2,500-year-old teaching given on a warm evening in a deer park in northern India, something that names what they have been experiencing and points towards something they have been reaching for. It has turned all the way here. All the way to this room, this night, this breath. The Deer Park is very still. Kandana lies on his side in the dark, his face carrying something that was not in his face at the beginning of the evening. A quality of settledness, of completed arrival, of a search that has found what it was searching for and can now simply be what it is, without the searching. Vapa and Badya and Mahanama and Asaji are shapes in the near dark, breathing steadily, somewhere between the teaching they have received and the sleep that is beginning to claim them. And the man in the saffron robe who walked 5 weeks to give this teaching and then gave it through an entire night is sitting quietly at the center of what he has made, which is not a philosophical system or a religious institution or a doctrine, but a living thing, a quality of understanding that has been planted in 5 minds and will grow and spread and divide and grow again for as long as the world contains minds capable of receiving it. And the stars are fading, not because they are going anywhere, because the sky is beginning to lighten very slowly, at the very edge of the east, not visibly yet, not light you could point to, but something in the quality of the dark that suggests to whatever deep sense in you is attuned to such things, that the night has found its turning point and is beginning, without any announcement, move in the direction of morning. You don't have to answer the question tonight. You don't have to arrive anywhere or achieve anything or be different from what you are at this moment in this breath. You don't have to understand completely. You don't have to feel that something definitive has happened, or that you are any different from the person who arrived at the beginning of this night, before the park appeared and the fire was lit and the 5 men took their places. You are different, not dramatically, not in any way that would be visible from the outside or that you could point to precisely. But the words have arrived, and words arrive in people and do what they do there, below the level of the conscious tracking of information, in the territory where things actually change. And something has been received tonight, in whatever way you were capable of receiving it, that will do what it does in you in whatever time and whatever form is right for that. Just let the question rest. Let it sit in you the way a stone sits in a river, held by the current, part of the river now, worn slowly smooth by the water that is always moving past it, not answered, not dismissed, not anxiously examined for signs of progress, just held, just present, just yours. And notice, if you are willing to notice, just once, just briefly, just gently, before sleep comes or has already come, how much quieter it is right now than it was when you first arrived. How something that was held tightly is right now just slightly less tightly held. How the breath is just slightly freer. How the night around you and in you has just the faintest quality of morning in it. Even though morning has not yet come, even though the dark is still the dark, even though nothing has yet changed that you could name or point to. Whatever is of the nature to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. And what remains when the arising and the ceasing have been fully and clearly seen is not nothing, is not absence, is not the empty space where something used to be. It is everything, all of awareness, all of warmth, all of the capacity for presence and care and genuine contact with the world. All of it still here, all of it real, but no longer burning, no longer contracted, no longer costing the enormous and unacknowledged effort that the fever was costing. It is exactly this breath, this dark, this quiet, 3 things to carry into sleep, or into whatever is waiting for you on the other side of this night. The first, the Buddha did not bring peace from somewhere else, from some other realm where it existed in pure form and could be transported here by someone with the access and the means to transport it. He found it here. He found it in the texture of ordinary experience, the nature of the mind that every human being has, in the laws that govern the arising and the ceasing of suffering, laws that were always there, always in operation, always available to be seen, and waiting only for someone with the quality of attention and the quality of sincerity to look at them directly and see them for what they were. He pointed at the ground you are already standing on. The second, every path begins with a step you didn't entirely know you were taking. Kundana didn't know in the moment the seeing came that it was going to come in that moment. He had been walking toward it for decades, through study and practice and years of waiting and years of disappointment, and the particular evening that ended in the watching of a man approach across dark grass. He had been walking toward it the whole time, taking step after step in its direction without knowing when the direction would suddenly, without announcement, arrive at where it was going. You are walking too. You have been walking on. The path you have been on, with all its turns and detours and moments of doubt and moments of unexpected clarity, has been a path, and it has been going somewhere, and it is still going. A third, the one I want to leave with you here at the very end of this long night, here in the warmth and the dark, here at the edge of sleep or already past it. The question, am I free, is not a question about the future, not about whether you will be free someday, after enough practice and enough change and enough of the self has been transformed. It is a question about right now, about this moment, and about the quality of attention that is present in you right now, asking it, and the asking itself sincere, open, not demanding, not testing, just genuinely wondering, is already the beginning of the answer. Already a small release of the grip, already the not beginning in the very asking to loosen. You are here, you have been here all along. The wheel turns, quietly, continuously, in you and through you, and as you, this breath, this moment, this endless and ordinary and utterly astonishing now. Sleep well.